They smashed everything, every single gift, the bikes, the coats, the dolls, all of it. Those children were sitting at breakfast asking me why Santa didn't come, and I didn't have a single answer for them. Daniel Whitmore's voice spoke on the phone that morning, and the man on the other end of the line, a man who had heard a lot of hard things in his life, went completely silent. That silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Jack Reynolds said, "Give me the address. If you're watching this story and it moves you the way it moves me, please subscribe to our channel and follow this all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels." The call came in at 6:47 on Christmas morning. Daniel Whitmore had not slept. He had been awake since 2 in the morning, sitting at his desk at Hope Valley Children's Home in Silver Creek, staring at the wall and trying to figure out what he was going to say to 23 children when they came down for breakfast. He had been running the orphanage for 11 years, and in all that time, he had never felt what he was feeling right now. It wasn't grief exactly. It wasn't anger, though the anger was there too, deep and hot somewhere behind his ribs. It was something closer to shame, the kind of shame that comes when you have made a promise you cannot keep to people who trusted you completely. He picked up the phone on the second ring. "Daniel." It was Margaret Hale, his assistant director, and from the sound of her voice, he knew she hadn't slept either. "I just went down to check the storage building again. I thought maybe I was wrong last night. Maybe I missed something." "Margaret, there's nothing, Daniel. There is nothing left." He already knew that. He had been the one to open the storage building at 2 in the morning after the night janitor called him. He had been the one to walk through the wreckage in the dark with a flashlight, stepping over broken plastic and twisted metal, picking up pieces of things and setting them back down because there was nothing to be done with pieces. A bicycle with both wheels ripped off, a box of dolls that had been stomped flat, coats slashed down the middle, board games open and scattered across the floor, like the person doing it had taken real pleasure in the destruction, had wanted to make sure nothing could be salvaged, nothing could be repaired. Whoever did this had not been in a hurry. That was the thing that stayed with Daniel in the hours that followed. They had taken their time. "The kids are going to be up in an hour," he said. "I know. What do I tell them?" Margaret didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was careful and quiet. "You tell them the truth. You tell them something happened and that we're going to fix it. You tell them Christmas isn't canceled, it's just delayed." "That's a lie." "Daniel, we have nothing, Margaret. There is nothing to fix this with. We spent everything we had on those gifts, every donation, every penny from the fall fundraiser, everything those families gave us. It's all in that building in pieces." He stopped, pressed his hand flat against the desk. "I'm going to have to look Emily Parker in the face this morning and tell her there's no Christmas." The line was quiet. Emily Parker had arrived at Hope Valley in October, 3 days after her mother died from a heart attack on the kitchen floor of their apartment while Emily was at school. She was 8 years old. She had no father listed on her birth certificate, no grandparents, no aunts or uncles who could take her. She had come to the orphanage with a single canvas tote bag containing 3 changes of clothes, a library book she had borrowed and never returned, and a small stuffed rabbit missing one eye that she kept on her pillow every night without fail. In the 2 months since she arrived, Emily had not cried once, not in front of anyone. She was polite and quiet and helped the younger children without being asked, and every single staff member at Hope Valley had silently agreed without discussing it that if they could do one thing this Christmas season, it was going to be making sure Emily Parker had a real Christmas morning. They had found the porcelain doll she had pointed to in a store window on a November trip to town, $12 at a second-hand shop, but it was perfect blonde hair, a blue dress, the kind of doll that looked like something out of a storybook. One of the volunteers had wrapped it herself in silver paper with a white ribbon. That doll was somewhere in the wreckage of the storage building right now. And Daniel didn't even know if the pieces were still there or if the people who had done this had taken the debris with them. "I'll call the churches," Margaret said finally. "Someone might have something we can pull together on short notice. It's Christmas morning. I know what morning it is. Nobody is going to answer their phones. Then I'll keep calling until someone does." She paused. "Daniel, go get yourself a cup of coffee. The kids aren't up yet. We still have a little time." He hung up and sat there another moment. Then he got up and went to the kitchen. He was standing at the coffee maker when he heard the first footsteps on the stairs. He turned around. It was Emily. She was wearing her pajamas and her hair was loose around her face, and she was holding the one-eyed rabbit against her chest, and she looked at him with those careful eyes. She always had the eyes that were always watching, always measuring, always trying to figure out what the adults around her were really thinking. "Is it Christmas?" she asked. Daniel opened his mouth. He closed it. "It is," he said. "Merry Christmas, Emily." She studied him for a moment longer. Then she said, "You look like something bad happened." 8 years old, and she could read a room better than most adults he knew. He thought about what Margaret had said. "You tell them the truth." He thought about the storage building. He thought about the silver-wrapped package with the white ribbon. "Something did happen," he said, "but I'm working on it. Can you do me a favor and not wake the others up yet? Let them sleep a little longer." She looked at him steadily. "Okay," she said, and she turned and went back up the stairs without another word. Daniel stood in the kitchen with his untouched coffee and thought, "I have to fix this. I don't know how, but I have to fix this." He didn't know yet that he wasn't going to be the one who fixed it. Boom. The police arrived at 8 o'clock. By then, the children were awake, and Daniel had gathered his staff in the hallway and spoken to them quickly and quietly while Margaret kept the kids occupied in the dining room with breakfast and Christmas music playing on the radio. He told them what had happened. He watched their faces go through the same sequence, disbelief, then anger, then something that looked like grief. Karen, who had been a house mother at Hope Valley for 7 years, pressed her fingers over her mouth and turned toward the wall. Tom, who maintained the building and had spent 3 weekends in November assembling donated bicycles in the storage room, said something under his breath that Daniel chose not to hear. "Right now, our only job is keeping the kids calm," Daniel told them. "We are not going to let them see us fall apart. Whatever we're feeling, we hold it together today." Understood. Nobody disagreed. The 2 officers who showed up, younger guys, both of them, one named Reyes and one named Harris, walked through the storage building with Daniel and took photographs and wrote things in their notebooks. And they were professional, and they were sympathetic, and they told him exactly what he already knew they were going to tell him. "We'll file a report," Officer Reyes said. "But without witnesses or security footage, it's going to be very difficult to identify who did this." "There's no camera on that building," Daniel said. "We never had the budget for it." "I understand, we'll do what we can, but there were 23 children in this building last night," Daniel said. He wasn't raising his voice. He was keeping it very level, because if he stopped keeping it level, he didn't know what would happen. 23 kids who had nothing, and somebody came in here and made sure they had even less. Reyes nodded slowly. "I hear you, sir, I really do. I'm not asking for your sympathy, I'm asking you to find out who did this. We'll do everything we can." Daniel watched them leave and thought it won't be enough. He was right. He had been dealing with Victor Caldwell for 8 months. It had started the previous April with a letter, formal corporate, printed on expensive paper from a company called Caldwell Development Group, expressing interest in acquiring the property at 4400 River Road, Silver Creek, the address of Hope Valley Children's Home. The letter was polite. It used words like opportunity and fair market value and mutual benefit. Daniel had read it twice, set it down on his desk, and called his board of directors. The board had voted unanimously to decline. The second letter came in June. This one was less polite. It referenced zoning regulations and property assessments and made veiled references to the possibility of legal challenges regarding the orphanage's operating permits. Daniel had forwarded it to the board's attorney, who had spent 2 weeks going through every piece of paperwork Hope Valley had ever filed, and came back with a report that said, essentially, everything is in order. But this is going to be expensive to fight if it comes to that. The third communication wasn't a letter. It was a phone call directly to Daniel from Victor Caldwell himself. Daniel had spoken to Victor Caldwell twice in his life, and both times he had come away with the same feeling. The feeling of talking to someone who was accustomed to getting what he wanted and had developed over many years a very particular skill for making other people feel that resistance was not only futile but somehow unreasonable. "Mr. Whitmore," Caldwell had said. His voice was smooth and unhurried. "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot." "I don't think we've gotten off on any foot, Mr. Caldwell. We're not selling the property. I understand you have concerns. I have children, 23 of them. This building is their home. And we would, of course, provide resources to help you relocate to a more suitable facility. This is a suitable facility. It has been a suitable facility for 60 years. A brief pause. Then Caldwell said pleasantly, Mr. Whitmore, I'm trying to make this easy for you. I appreciate that, Daniel said. The answer is still no. He had hung up the phone and sat there, and the skin on the back of his neck had been doing the thing it did sometimes when something was wrong, when something was coming. He had called the board chair that evening and said, I think we need to be prepared for this to escalate. The board chair had told him to document everything. He had documented everything. It hadn't mattered. Because what came next wasn't a letter or a phone call or a legal filing. What came next was someone cutting the orphanage's water line in September, blamed on aging infrastructure. And a van with no plates that circled the property several nights in a row in October. And when Daniel called the police, they said there was nothing they could do about a vehicle driving on public streets. And a former employee dismissed for cause 2 years prior who suddenly appeared at a town council meeting in November claiming Hope Valley had financial irregularities, a claim that took 3 weeks and significant legal fees to disprove. None of it could be tied to Victor Caldwell directly. None of it was ever going to be tied to Victor Caldwell directly. And now it was Christmas morning, and the storage building was a disaster, and the police had come and gone, and Daniel was standing in the hallway of his orphanage, listening to Christmas music playing in the dining room, and knowing with a cold and absolute certainty that he was beaten. That was when his cell phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. He answered, Is this Daniel Whitmore, director of Hope Valley Children's Home? The voice was rough, not hostile, but rough the way a voice gets when it's been through things. A voice that had spent a lot of years outdoors and in loud rooms. Yes, Daniel said. Who is this? My name is Jack Reynolds. I saw the news this morning about what happened to your orphanage. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Someone had called the local news station at some point, he didn't even know who, and there had been a brief segment on the morning broadcast. He had forgotten about it entirely in the chaos. I'm sorry, Daniel said. I don't think we've met. We haven't. A pause. Mr. Whitmore, I want to ask you something and I need you to give me a straight answer. All right. How bad is it? Something about the directness of the question. No preamble, no performance of sympathy. Just a straight ask made Daniel answer the same way. It's bad, he said. There's nothing left. Everything we had for those kids is destroyed. Everything. Every gift. Every coat. Everything we collected for months. I have 23 children in that dining room right now who are going to figure out very soon that Christmas isn't coming. The pause on the other end lasted 4 full seconds. Then Jack Reynolds said, Give me the address. Daniel gave him the address. He didn't know why. He didn't know this man. He didn't know what the man intended to do with the address of a children's home on Christmas morning. But something in the quality of that pause, something in the weight of it, the way it felt like a decision being made, rather than a silence being filled, made him answer. He hung up and went back to the dining room. The children were finishing breakfast. The Christmas music was still playing. Most of the kids were quiet in the particular way children are quiet when they're waiting for something and beginning to suspect the something isn't coming. One of the younger boys, a 5-year-old named Marcus, had climbed into Karen's lap and fallen back asleep with his head against her shoulder. The older kids were watching the windows. Emily Parker was sitting at the end of the table with her hands folded in front of her and her one-eyed rabbit on the bench beside her, and she was looking directly at Daniel when he walked in. Who was on the phone? She asked. Several of the other children looked up. Someone who heard about what happened, Daniel said. Are they going to help? He looked at her careful, watchful face and thought, I don't know. I have absolutely no idea. A stranger called with a rough voice and asked for our address, and I gave it to him because I was desperate and I had nothing left to lose. I hope so, he said. Emily considered this for a moment. Then she picked up her rabbit, tucked it under her arm, and turned back to her untouched plate. Tom came to find him at 9:30. He came in fast, his boots loud on the hallway floor, and his expression was somewhere between alarmed and something else that Daniel couldn't immediately identify. You need to come outside, Tom said. What's happening? Just come outside. Daniel followed him to the front door. Tom pushed it open and the cold came in sharp and clean, and Daniel stepped out onto the front steps of Hope Valley Children's Home. He heard it before he saw it. A low rolling sound, deep and rhythmic and growing. The kind of sound that seems to come up through the ground before it reaches your ears. He looked down River Road. They were coming from the north. A long, slow procession of motorcycles moving through the snow-dusted street, headlights on in the gray morning, exhaust rising in the cold air. He counted quickly and lost count. There were a lot of them, more than he'd expected, more than he could have imagined. Behind the motorcycles came pickup trucks. 3 of them, then 4. Their beds were loaded with things he couldn't quite make out yet. Large items wrapped in plastic against the weather boxes, stacked high bags. Tom was standing beside him, and he still hadn't said anything, and Daniel realized the expression on his face wasn't alarm at all. It was awe. The lead motorcycle pulled up to the curb and stopped. The rider put down the kickstand and swung off in a single practiced motion, pulled off his helmet, and looked up at Daniel on the steps. He was somewhere in his mid-40s with a weathered face and dark eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something hard and left to set. He was wearing a leather jacket, and he was not a small man. He walked up to the steps and put out his hand. "Jack Reynolds," he said. Daniel shook it. "Daniel Whitmore." Jack looked past him at the door. "How many kids you got in there?" 23. "Any of them looking out the windows right now?" Daniel turned. Through the glass of the front door, through the hallway, he could see that the dining room had gone quiet in a very specific way. He could see small faces appearing at the windows on either side of the door. "All of them," he said. Jack Reynolds almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile, more like the shape of one, a brief softening around his eyes. He turned and looked back at his crew still sitting on their bikes or standing beside the trucks, waiting. He raised one hand. The truck started pulling forward. Daniel learned later, piecing it together from what Jack told him over the following hours, what had happened between 6:47 and 9:30 that morning. Jack Reynolds had seen the news segment at 6:15. He had been awake since 5, which was normal for him, sitting at the table in the clubhouse with coffee and the television on low. He had watched the 30-second clip, a reporter standing in front of Hope Valley, the orphanage director's voice off camera saying they were devastated. A brief shot of the damaged storage building, and he had sat there for a moment. Then he had walked into the back room where 4 of his guys were sleeping on cots after the Christmas Eve gathering the night before, and he had turned the lights on. "Get up," he said. There had been some grumbling. Now, there had been no more grumbling. Well, he had explained the situation in approximately 90 seconds. Then he had said, "Here's what we're going to do." And he had laid it out who was going to make calls, who was going to drive what they needed, and where they were going to get it at 7 in the morning on Christmas Day. What followed was what happened when a man like Jack Reynolds decided something needed to happen. Calls went out across 2 counties. Phones rang in houses and apartments and other clubhouses. People who had been planning a quiet Christmas morning found themselves suddenly unplanning it and found to their own mild surprise that they didn't mind. Because there was a specific kind of person who would get a phone call at 6:30 on Christmas morning about 23 orphan children and not answer that call. And none of the people in Jack Reynolds' world were that kind of person. By 8 o'clock, there were 24 men making runs to every Walmart and Target and drugstore they could find open. Bicycles were bought, coats in every size from the inventory sheets someone had thought to pull from the news segment's background shot of the damage report. Toys, games, books, wrapped or unwrapped, didn't matter. Gift bags from gas stations, candy, Christmas stockings grabbed off clearance racks. One guy showed up with 3 remote-controlled cars still in their boxes and a bag of oranges, which he felt strongly about because of something his grandmother had told him once, and nobody argued. By 9 o'clock, it was loaded. By 9:30, 41 motorcycles and 4 pickup trucks were rolling down River Road toward Hope Valley Children's Home. Daniel held the front door open. The children poured out. Not all at once first, tentatively, the older ones who had been watching from the windows edging through the door and stopping on the steps staring. Then the younger ones behind them pressing forward, and then suddenly all of them, and the formality of it, collapsed, and they were running down the steps into the cold morning air. Voices breaking into sounds that weren't quite words, yet just sounds, surprise, and joy mixing together into something that had no name. The bikers, for their part, had clearly not fully anticipated this part. 23 children, full speed is a significant force. Several of the men took an involuntary step back. One very large man named Denny, who had a reputation that would have given most people pause, found a 6-year-old girl named Sophie wrapped around his leg and looked down at her with an expression of complete helplessness before carefully, awkwardly reaching down and patting her on the head. "Hey," he said. Hey, okay. Hey, kid. Sophie looked up at him with enormous eyes. Did you bring presents? Yeah, Denny said. Yeah, we brought presents. Sophie made a sound that Denny would later in private describe as the best thing he'd heard in years. Jack Reynolds stood at the truck and watched it all and did not say anything for a while. Daniel came to stand beside him. I don't know how to thank you, Daniel said. Then don't, Jack said. He was watching a boy named Marcus who had come out still half asleep and was now fully awake and talking very rapidly to a man in a leather jacket about what kind of bicycle he had always wanted. The man in the leather jacket was listening with complete seriousness and nodding at each detail. Where's the girl? Jack said. Which one? The one from the news. 8 years old, blonde hair. Daniel turned. He scanned the steps in the yard. There, he said. Emily Parker was standing on the second step. From the bottom, not running, not shouting, just standing and watching everything happening around her with those careful eyes. She had the one-eyed rabbit tucked under her left arm. In her right hand, she was holding something, a small piece of something Daniel realized, a fragment of silver wrapping paper she must have found in the storage building. Jack Reynolds walked over to the truck and dug through one of the bags for a moment. Then he walked to the bottom of the steps and looked up at Emily. She looked down at him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. I heard somebody wrecked your Christmas, Jack said. Emily considered him for a moment. Yes, she said, that's not right. No, she agreed, it wasn't. He held out the bag. She looked at it. She looked at him. Then she came down the last 2 steps and took it, set it carefully on the step beside her, and opened it. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper from a gas station gift section, was a porcelain doll with blonde hair and a blue dress. It wasn't the exact one. It couldn't be the exact one, was in pieces in a storage building. But it was close. Someone had found it in a store that morning. One of the men had driven 20 minutes to a shop that was open, and it was the kind of doll that looked like it had come from a storybook. Emily held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were bright and careful, and she was not crying because Emily Parker had decided at some point in the last 2 months that she was not going to cry in front of people. But something in her face had shifted. Some hell-braced thing had let go just slightly, just enough. Thank you, she said. Jack Reynolds nodded once. Merry Christmas, kid. Emily looked at the doll again. Then she looked at the yard full of children in leather jackets, in motorcycles and Christmas bags, and she said quietly and without particular drama, as though she were stating a simple fact she had just worked out, I thought nobody was going to come. Jack was quiet for a moment. Somebody always comes, he said. Emily tucked the doll against her chest beside the rabbit and went to join the other children. Daniel watched Jack Reynolds watch her go. She's going to be all right, Jack said. It was not a question. I think so, Daniel said. Yeah. Jack turned back to the truck. Let's get this stuff inside. It's cold out here. By noon, the dining hall looked like something out of a dream. Gifts were stacked and distributed. Coats were tried on and argued over in the comfortable way children argue over good things, and the table that had been silent and heavy that morning was now loud and warm and completely changed. Karen had somehow produced a batch of hot chocolate from somewhere and was distributing it in mismatched mugs. Tom had found Christmas music on the radio again, louder this time. Several of the bikers had stayed to help assemble things, a bicycle here, a board game there, and the sight of large, weathered men kneeling on the floor of a children's dining room, carefully reading instruction manuals, was something that Daniel was fairly certain he would never forget as long as he lived. One man named Calhoun, who had arms covered in tattoos that made most adults stare, sat on the floor for 45 minutes playing a card game with 3 children who took turns beating him decisively and seemed to find this hilarious. Calhoun accepted each defeat with solemn dignity and demanded rematches, which the children were happy to provide. Daniel moved through the room and felt something he didn't quite have a word for. Not just relief, though it was that too. Something deeper. The specific grace of being wrong about how alone you are. He found Jack at the edge of the room, coffee cup in hand, watching. Can I ask you something? Daniel said. Sure. Why did you come? You don't know us. You don't know any of these kids. Jack was quiet for a moment. He watched Marcus, who had graduated from describing his ideal bicycle to actually riding one, in careful loops around the dining room, which was technically against the rules, but which nobody was currently enforcing. I grew up in a place like this, Jack said finally. Not exactly like this, not as good as this actually, but a place, a system. You know what I mean? Daniel nodded. I know what it feels like to be a kid and have the thing you were hoping for just not be there. And I know what it feels like when somebody shows up anyway. When somebody decides you're worth showing up for. He took a drink of his coffee. We got a call. We showed up. That's all. That's not all, Daniel said quietly. Jack looked at him sideways. No, he said after a moment. Maybe not. Across the room, Emily Parker was sitting in a chair with the porcelain doll in her lap and the rabbit beside her, and she was showing both of them to a small boy who was listening with great seriousness to what appeared to be a formal introduction. She was not crying, her face was intent and alive and careful, and somewhere in it, unmistakably, was something that had not been there that morning. Daniel watched her and thought it won't always be this hard. It won't always be this close. But today, somehow against everything, it had worked out. Today, somebody had come. Jack Reynolds left Hope Valley at 2 in the afternoon. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't gather the children for a formal goodbye or shake hands with everyone in the room. He just finished his third cup of coffee, set the mug in the kitchen sink, found Daniel in the hallway and said, "We're heading out." Daniel walked him to the door. Outside, the men who had stayed were pulling on jackets and helmets, mounting up the trucks already turned around and pointed back toward the highway. The afternoon had gone gray and cold, the kind of cold that settles in for the night and means business. I don't know how to do this properly, Daniel said. Thank you doesn't feel like enough. It's enough, Jack said. He zipped his jacket. You going to be okay from here? Daniel thought about what from here actually meant. The gifts were distributed. The children were fed and warm, and for the moment genuinely happy in the uncomplicated way that children can be happy when the immediate crisis has passed. But the storage building was still a wreck. Victor Caldwell still owned half the town. The property was still under threat, and the legal bills were still mounting, and the police investigation was, Daniel was fairly certain, already going nowhere. Honestly, he said, yeah, I don't know. Jack looked at him for a moment, not with sympathy exactly, more with the focused attention of someone taking a measurement. What's the actual situation, not just today, the whole thing? Daniel told him. He hadn't planned to. It wasn't the kind of thing you unloaded on a man you'd met 4 hours ago. But Jack asked the question like someone who expected a real answer, and Daniel was too exhausted to perform optimism, so he gave him the real answer. He told him about Caldwell, the letters, the pressure, the water line, the van, the false accusations at the town council. The fact that everything that had been done to Hope Valley for the past 8 months had been done carefully enough that none of it could be proven. And the fact that whoever had destroyed the storage building the last night had done the same clean enough that the police could document it but not solve it. Jack listened to all of it without interrupting. When Daniel finished, there was a silence. Caldwell Development Group, Idea Group, Jack said. That's the company, yes. And this Caldwell, he wants the land. He wants to build luxury condominiums. This property sits on 12 acres right on the river. It's the last undeveloped riverfront land in Silver Creek. Jack was quiet again. He was looking at the middle distance, not at Daniel, and his jaw had a set to it that Daniel was beginning to recognize as the expression he wore when he was deciding something. Give me a few days, Jack said. For what? Jack looked at him directly. Do you trust me? Daniel considered the question. 4 hours ago, this man had been a stranger. Now he was standing on Daniel's front steps, having just delivered Christmas to 23 children who had been promised nothing and received everything. Yes, Daniel said. Then give me a few days. Jack pulled on his helmet. Don't talk to Caldwell. Don't talk to the police about Caldwell specifically. Don't do anything that looks like you're making a move. Just run your orphanage and take care of your kids and let me make some calls. What kind of calls? But Jack was already walking down the steps. He swung onto his motorcycle, started it, that deep rolling sound that Daniel was starting to associate with something other than what most people associated it with, and pulled out onto River Road without looking back. Daniel stood on the steps and watched the last of the convoy disappear around the bend. He stood there a moment longer. Then he went back inside. Victor Caldwell spent Christmas at his house on the north end of Silver Creek, a large modern structure on a hill that overlooked the town, which was either ironic or completely on brand, depending on how you looked at it. He had 2 phones, one personal, one business. On Christmas Day, he kept the personal one in his pocket and left the business one on his desk because he was disciplined about things like that. Christmas was Christmas. Business was the other 364 days. He knew about the storage building by 6 in the morning. The man he'd hired, a person he had contacted through a series of intermediaries, specifically so that no connection could be established, had texted him a confirmation code the night before, which meant the job was done. Victor had read the text, deleted it, and gone back to sleep. I was not a cruel man. He told himself that regularly. He was a practical man who had learned over 20 years in development that sentiment was the enemy of progress. The orphanage was an obstacle. Daniel Whitmore was a man who refused to see reason. The gifts had been destroyed not out of cruelty but out of strategy, to demoralize, to exhaust, to make the path of least resistance look more attractive than continued resistance. It would work. These things always worked eventually. By Christmas afternoon, when he saw the brief follow-up news segment, the one showing motorcycles arriving at Hope Valley, children running down the steps, some biker charity organization turning the whole disaster into a feel-good story, he felt the first thing he'd felt that was close to unease. He told himself it didn't matter. A good news cycle. It would fade in a week. He told himself he was not concerned. He was lying. The call came in on December 27th. Daniel was in his office catching up on correspondence that had piled up over the holiday when his phone rang. The number was local but unfamiliar. "Mr. Whitmore," a man's voice, careful, measured, professional. "My name is Alan Briggs. I'm an attorney." Daniel set down his pen. "Okay. I've been retained by a group of parties who have some concerns about recent events involving your organization. I'm not at liberty to name my clients at this stage, but I want you to know that the matters we're looking into are serious and that we believe we have significant evidence of criminal activity directed at Hope Valley Children's Home." Daniel was very still. "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that will be difficult to explain away." A pause. "I'd like to meet with you in person, Mr. Whitmore, at your convenience. There are some things I need to show you and some questions I'd like to ask." Daniel thought about what Jack Reynolds had said, "Don't make a move." "Who retained you?" he asked. "I'm not able to say at this point, but I can tell you that the parties involved are serious people who are taking this situation seriously." Daniel thought Jack made some calls. "Tomorrow morning," he said, 9 o'clock. Alan Briggs was not what Daniel had expected. He was somewhere in his early 40s, quiet-spoken, unremarkable in the particular way that very good lawyers can be, the kind of man who could sit in any room and not stand out until he opened a file folder, at which point the room tended to reorganize itself around him. He sat across from Daniel and opened a file folder. "Here's what we have," he said. What they had was more than Daniel knew how to process at first. Briggs walked him through it, piece by piece. The man who had been hired to destroy the storage building, his name was Gary Letts, and he had a record and a pattern, and crucially a phone that had made contact with an intermediary who had made contact with a shell company registered in Delaware that had received payments from a real estate holding company that was a subsidiary of Caldwell Development Group. It was not a straight line. Victor Caldwell had been careful about that, but it was a line, and the people who had traced it had been both motivated and methodical. "How did you get this?" Daniel said. Briggs looked at him over the file. "People talk," he said, "especially when the right questions are asked by the right people." Daniel thought about Jack Reynolds and the underground connections that the news segment had mentioned, the phrase the reporter had used, "men who know the streets better than anyone." He thought about what that actually meant in practice. He thought about what kinds of questions could be asked and by whom in the places where Gary Letts and people like him spent their time. "And this is solid," he said. "It's solid enough to take to the DA's office. Whether the DA does anything with it is a different question, but it's solid enough that Victor Caldwell is going to have a very uncomfortable conversation with his own lawyers when this lands on his desk." Briggs closed the folder. "There's something else." "What?" "We've identified 2 other properties where Caldwell used similar tactics to force a sale. A community center in Hartfield 3 years ago, a church property in Denison 2 years ago. In both cases, the owners eventually sold under pressure and later claimed they'd been coerced, but neither had the documentation to prove it. We're talking to both of them now." Daniel sat back in his chair. He had spent 8 months feeling like he was fighting this alone, like he was one man with limited resources going up against someone with unlimited patience and money and no ethical floor. And now he was sitting across from a lawyer with a folder that represented more investigative work than his entire organization had resources to produce, and it had been assembled in 48 hours by people he had not asked and could not pay. "What does this cost?" he said. Briggs looked at him. "My fee is being handled." "By who?" "By the parties who retained me." He picked up his briefcase. "I'd suggest you get your board chair on the phone today. This is moving quickly, and you'll want everyone prepared." The story broke publicly on January 23rd. Not in the way Daniel had expected, not a slow leak through the local paper or a quiet referral to the district attorney's office. It broke the way things break when someone has decided they should break loudly, and that someone had clearly thought carefully about the timing. A regional news station ran a 12-minute investigative segment at 6 o'clock. The reporting woman named Christine Park, who had covered the orphanage Christmas story, and then apparently kept pulling the thread, laid out the connections between Victor Caldwell, the shell company, the intermediary, and Gary Letts with a clarity that was devastating in its simplicity. She had the documents. She had two sources on camera, their faces obscured, describing how they had been approached by intermediaries working for Caldwell's organization on previous projects. She had Victor Caldwell's own spokesperson on camera saying, "We have no comment on these allegations," in a way that, as anyone who watches local news knows, is the opposite of reassuring. Daniel watched it from the common room at Hope Valley with most of his staff around him. Nobody said anything for a long time after it ended. Karen was the first to speak. "How did she get all that?" Daniel thought about Jack Reynolds. He thought about 41 motorcycles and 4 pickup trucks appearing in 2.5 hours on Christmas morning. He thought about what kind of network could produce that kind of response and what other things that kind of network could produce when it was motivated. "I don't know exactly," he said, which was technically true. His phone rang. It was the board chair who had watched the same segment and had 3 questions and a recommendation, all delivered rapidly. Then it rang again, a local alderman calling to express support, then a reporter from the regional paper, then someone from the state attorney general's office who had seen the segment and had some follow-up questions of their own about the Hartfield and Denison properties. By 10 that night, Daniel had spoken to 11 people he had never spoken to before, and Victor Caldwell's name was trending on local social media, and 2 of Caldwell's investors had reportedly requested urgent calls with his office, and the Silver Creek Town Council had announced it would take up the matter of the orphanage property at its next meeting. Daniel sat at his desk at 11:30 and looked at his phone and thought Jack made some calls. He dialed the number Jack had given him before leaving on Christmas Day. It rang 4 times. He was about to hang up. "Yeah," Jack's voice. Background noise, something low music, maybe voices. "It's Daniel Whitmore." A brief pause. "I know who it is. How you doing?" "I watched the news tonight." "Okay." "Jack, what did you do?" Another pause. Not uncomfortable, more like the kind of pause a man makes when he's deciding how much to say. "I told you I'd make some calls," Jack said. "That was more than calls. Sometimes calls lead to other things." Daniel looked at the ceiling, the lawyer, the evidence, Christine Park's segment. "I don't know anything about a news segment," Jack said in the tone of someone who knows everything about a news segment. "Jack." "Daniel." And his voice shifted slightly, still rough, still direct, but with something underneath it that was almost gentle. "You got 23 kids in that building. You've been fighting one guy with too much money and no conscience for 8 months, mostly alone. Sometimes when somebody's fighting alone and they shouldn't be alone, somebody evens it up a little, that's all. You evened it up a lot. Maybe he had a lot more than you did." Daniel let out a breath that he felt he had been holding for approximately 8 months. "Thank you," he said. "I know I keep saying that." "You can stop saying it." "I can't." A short silence. "How are the kids?" "Good. Emily Parker has named the doll. She calls it Clara." He could hear something in Jack's breathing that might have been a laugh, very quiet, very brief. "Good name," Jack said. "She told one of the other girls that Clara used to be lost, but now she's home." Daniel paused. "I think she was talking about herself." Jack didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. "Get some sleep," Jack said. "Things are going to move fast now. You need to be sharp." He hung up. Daniel sat for another moment. Then he turned off his desk lamp and went to check on the building before bed, the way he did every night, walking the hallways, listening to the quiet, making sure everything was secure. He stopped outside Emily's room. The door was open an inch the way she liked it. He could see the faint outline of her in the bed, the rabbit on the pillow, and beside the rabbit, propped carefully against the headboard, the porcelain doll with the blue dress, Clara. He pulled the door softly to its usual angle and kept walking. Victor Caldwell called his lead attorney at 7 in the morning on January 4th. The attorney's name was Stephen Park, no relation to the reporter, and he had been Caldwell's legal counsel for 9 years and had seen Victor Caldwell in many moods, but the voice on the phone that morning was one he hadn't heard before. "How bad is this?" Caldwell said. Park had been up since 5:30, reviewing the documents that Christine Park's segment had referenced. "Bad," he said. "Not unsurvivable, but bad. The Delaware connection is the problem. Whoever traced that was thorough." "Who traced it?" "That's what I'm trying to find out. The sourcing in the segment is vague, but whoever handed Park those documents knew what they were looking for. This wasn't a tip from an anonymous witness. Someone did real investigative work." A pause. "Victor, do you know anyone in the Hells Angels?" Caldwell was silent for a moment. "What?" "The Christmas story, the motorcycles at the orphanage. I looked into it. That chapter is Jack Reynolds. Reynolds has been in Silver Creek for 12 years. He's clean, no current charges, nothing actionable, but he has connections across 2 states, and he's the kind of man who, if he decided to look into something, would know exactly who to ask." Park paused, and he apparently decided to look into something. Caldwell processed this. His jaw tightened. "He's a biker. He's a biker who apparently has very good sources," Park said, "and who appears to have decided for whatever reason that your business practices are his concern." Another pause. "Victor, if this goes to the DA and they look at Hartfield and Denison too, this stops being a local matter." "I know that. We need to talk about options. I'll be in your office at 9. He hung up and stood at the window and looked down at Silver Creek, the town he had been developing piece by piece for 15 years, a town where his name was on 3 buildings and 2 park benches in a wing of the hospital. And he thought about a man on a motorcycle who had made some phone calls. He did not feel the way he had expected to feel now that things were shifting. He had been in difficult positions before and navigated them. He was good at navigating them. But this felt different. This felt like something that had started as a real estate dispute and become something else entirely. Something that involved 23 children in Christmas morning and a woman named Christine Park who had kept pulling a thread, and a man who had shown up in 48 hours with more documentation than Caldwell's own lawyers had produced in 8 months of careful maneuvering. He picked up his personal phone and called his property manager. "The Hope Valley acquisition," he said. "Put it on hold." A pause. "For how long?" Caldwell looked out the window. "Indefinitely." He hung up. It wasn't an admission. It wasn't a surrender. It was the move of a practical man who understood when the terrain had shifted enough to require reassessment. But in the office of Alan Briggs, who had his own sources, word of that phone call arrived before noon, and Alan Briggs called Daniel Whitmore. "He's paused the acquisition," Briggs said. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Paused or stopped? Paused officially, but Victor Caldwell doesn't pause things. He either advances or retreats. This is a retreat dressed up as a pause. A brief silence. "We're not done yet. The DA's office called this morning. They want to meet, and the 2 property owners from Hartfield and Denison have both agreed to cooperate." Daniel sat down. He realized his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the particular physical reaction that happens when tension that has been held for a very long time begins slowly to release. "The property is safe," he said. "The property is safer than it was yesterday," Briggs said. "Let's take this one step at a time." "Okay," Daniel breathed. "Okay." He hung up and sat at his desk for a long moment. Through the wall, he could hear the sounds of the building around him. Children's voices. Someone's radio. Karen's voice calling someone's name in the corridor. The ordinary sounds of a place that was still standing. He thought about December 25th, about the phone ringing at 6:47 and a voice saying, "Give me the address." About what he had thought in that moment, which was, "I have nothing to lose." He had been wrong about that. He'd had everything to lose. He just hadn't been losing it alone. He picked up his phone again and called Margaret. "We need to get the board together," he said, "this week if possible. Things are moving." "Moving good or moving bad?" Margaret said. "I thought about Emily Parker and the porcelain doll propped against the headboard. He thought about Jack Reynolds saying somebody always comes. He thought about a 12-minute news segment in a DA's office making phone calls and a property developer who had spent 8 months as the most powerful person in the room and was now, for the first time, not sure how many people were in the room with him. Moving good, Daniel said. I think moving good. Gary Letts was arrested on January 6th. He was picked up at his apartment in the next county over, which suggested either that he had been planning to stay ahead of things or that he hadn't been planning very well, because the two detectives who arrived at his door that morning had a warrant and a very specific set of questions. And Gary Letts, who was not a complicated man and had never particularly enjoyed the kind of trouble that involved lawyers and depositions, made a decision in approximately 4 minutes that his employer had significantly overestimated his loyalty. He talked, not everything, not the kind of complete accounting that closes every door and answers every question, but enough to confirm the connection to the intermediary, enough to establish the timeline, enough to give the DA's office the foundation they needed to begin building a case that would take months to fully develop. But that started on January 6th with a very clear and direct line from a destroyed storage building in Silver Creek to a man in a suit who had looked at an orphanage and seen an obstacle. Daniel heard about the arrest from Briggs at noon. He was in the storage building at the time supervising Tom and 2 volunteers who were beginning the process of clearing out the debris to assess what repairs would be needed. He was wearing work gloves and had a piece of broken bicycle frame in his hand when his phone rang. He set down the frame. He listened. When he hung up, Tom was looking at him from across the building. "Good news," Tom said. Daniel looked at the wreckage around them, the shelves that had been knocked over the floor that still needed sweeping, the walls that needed repainting, the whole physical record of one night's deliberate cruelty. "Yes," he said. "Yeah, good news." Tom looked at the damage too. Then he picked up a broom and started sweeping. Daniel put his gloves back on and got to work. Because the building still needed repairing and the children still needed a storage room, and the law was going to take whatever time the law was going to take. And none of that stopped the daily business of a children's home that was still standing, that was going to keep standing, that had 23 people in it who needed someone to show up for them every single day. And Daniel Whitmore had never in 11 years failed to show up. He wasn't going to start now. He picked up a broken shelf bracket, looked at it, set it aside, and reached for the next piece. Somewhere in the town, in an office on a hill, Victor Caldwell was having a very different kind of conversation with very different people. And somewhere across 2 counties, Jack Reynolds was on his motorcycle going where he was going, doing what he did, and the world was turning the way the world turns, not always fairly, not always fast, but turning nonetheless. And in room 7 at Hope Valley Children's Home, a porcelain doll named Clara sat against a headboard next to a one-eyed rabbit waiting for a girl who was at school and would be home at 3:15. And the afternoon light moved across the floor the way it always did, and the building stood, and the building was going to keep standing. The storage building took 3 weeks to repair. Tom ran the operation like a man who had been waiting his whole career for a project that mattered this much. He came in early and stayed late and kept a running list of what was needed and what had been sourced and what still had to happen, and he moved through the building with the focused energy of someone paying a personal debt. Daniel didn't ask him about it. He understood it. Sometimes the only way to process what had been done to a place you loved was to put it back together with your own hands. The volunteers came in waves. Church groups, neighbors, people Daniel had never met who had seen the news and wanted to do something that wasn't just clicking a like button. They painted and repaired and rebuilt shelves and replaced the storage units that had been destroyed. And by the 3rd week of January, the building looked better than it had before Christmas. Tom stood in the doorway on the last day and looked at it for a long moment and didn't say anything. And Daniel stood beside him and didn't say anything either, and that was enough. The legal process moved at its own pace, which was to say slowly, which was the nature of the law. Alan Briggs had warned him about that. "The DA's office is building a case," he said when Daniel called in the 2nd week of January asking for an update. "Building takes time. Gary Letts is cooperating, but his cooperation has limits. He can connect the intermediary. But the intermediary is the firewall between him and Caldwell, and that firewall was constructed carefully. Don't expect this to resolve in a month." "What should I expect?" "I'd plan for spring," Briggs said. "Maybe summer. These things have their own timeline." Daniel had learned over 11 years of running a children's home on a budget that never quite matched the need how to be patient with things he couldn't control. He had learned to work on the things in front of him, and trust that the larger things would resolve if the foundation was solid. So he went back to running Hope Valley. He fixed what could be fixed. He waited on what had to wait. What he hadn't planned for was what happened on January 18th. I was in a board meeting, the first full board meeting since Christmas, the one he had called when Briggs told him things were moving when his phone buzzed on the table. He had it face down. He didn't pick it up. It buzzed again. He flipped it over. The message was from a number he didn't recognize, and it said, "Check your email now, it's important." He looked up at the 6 faces around the table. "I'm sorry, give me 1 minute." He opened his email on his phone. The most recent message was from an address he didn't recognize, a string of letters and numbers at a generic provider with no subject line. He opened it. Inside was a single paragraph. He read it. He read it again. Daniel and the board chair, Howard Fitch, was watching him. "Everything all right?" Daniel set the phone face down very carefully, the way you set something down when you need your hands to be doing something deliberate, so the rest of you doesn't react to what you just read. "I need to make a call," he said. "Howard, can we take 10 minutes? He stepped into the hallway. He called Briggs. "Have you checked your email in the last hour?" Daniel said. "I've been in meetings." "Why, check it." He heard the sound of typing. Then a long silence. "Where did you get this?" Briggs said. His voice was very controlled. "Someone sent it anonymously. I assume the same person sent it to you." Another silence. Briggs was reading. He stopped. "This is the financial transfer record, the full chain, not the truncated version I showed you, the full chain. Victor Caldwell's name is on this. I know. His personal name. Not the shell company, not the holding company. His actual personal signature on a transfer authorization to the intermediary." "I know what I'm looking at," Daniel said. "The question is whether it's real." "That's the question," Briggs agreed. His voice had shifted into something that was still controlled, but also unmistakably electric. "If this is real, Daniel, if this document is legitimate, Victor Caldwell personally authorized the payment that funded the destruction of your storage building. That's not a civil matter. That's a criminal one. So the question is whether it's real." "Yes, and the question of where it came from." Daniel looked at the wall of the hallway. He thought about Jack Reynolds, who had said, "I don't know anything about a news segment," in the voice of someone who knew everything about a news segment. He thought about networks and connections and the kinds of questions that get asked in the kinds of places where certain kinds of information is kept. "I think I might know where it came from," Daniel said. "Don't tell me," Briggs said immediately. "Not yet. Let me get this to a forensic accountant first. If the document is authentic, the source is a secondary question. The document is the thing that matters." "How long?" "Give me 48 hours. Daniel went back into the board meeting. He sat down. He folded his hands on the table. "Sorry about that," he said. "Where were we?" Howard Fitch studied him for a moment. "You look like a man who just heard something significant." "I might have," Daniel said. "I'll know more in 48 hours. That night, he called Jack. The phone rang 3 times. Jack picked up on the 4th. "Whitmore," he said. "I got an email today," Daniel said. A pause. "A very specific email," Daniel continued, "with a very specific document attached. A document that has Victor Caldwell's name on it. His personal name, not a company name. Attached to a financial transfer that connects directly to what happened to my storage building on Christmas Eve." Silence on Jack's end. "Jack, I hear you. I need to know if this is real. I need to know if this is something I can trust, or if it's something that's going to blow up in my face when a forensic accountant looks at it." Another silence. Longer this time. "It's real," Jack said. Daniel exhaled slowly. "How?" "You asked too many questions," Jack said. Not unkindly, more like a man who is used to operating in a world where questions have limits. "Jack, if this goes to the DA and there's a problem with how it was obtained." "There's no problem with how it was obtained." "How can you be sure, Bam? Because the person who obtained it is very good at what they do. And what they do is find things that are hiding in places where things hide." A pause. "It's real, Daniel. Take it to your lawyer and let the lawyers do what lawyers do." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "This person who finds things, they found this specifically." "Yes, because you asked them to. I might have mentioned this situation. And they just did this, as a favor." Jack was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice had something in it that was hard to name. Something that was not quite humor and not quite seriousness, But somewhere between the two, the tone of someone referencing a world with its own logic that doesn't require outside explanation. In my world, Jack said, when someone does something to children, when someone deliberately, intentionally sets out to destroy what little those kids have, there are people who take that personally. And when those people take something personally, they tend to be very motivated about resolving it. Another pause. Victor Caldwell made himself very easy to be motivated about. Daniel sat with that for a moment. Tell them thank you, he said. They know. The forensic accountant Briggs brought in was a woman named Dr. Susan Holloway, who had spent 14 years in financial fraud investigation before going into private practice. She had a reputation for being, as Briggs put it, very hard to impress and very difficult to fool. She looked at the document for 2 days and called Briggs on the morning of January 21st. It's real, she said. Briggs called Daniel at 9:15. It's real, he said. Daniel was sitting in his office, and he had been waiting for this call with a particular kind of held breath stillness that he hadn't been fully aware of until the moment it broke. Okay, he said. We're taking it to the DA this afternoon. Okay. Daniel, do you understand what this means? He did. He had understood in the abstract for several days. But hearing it stated in the flat, certain voice of a lawyer who had just received confirmation from a forensic expert, that was different from understanding it in the abstract. It means Victor Caldwell personally signed off on what happened on Christmas Eve, Daniel said. It means Victor Caldwell is going to have a very serious conversation with law enforcement, and it means that conversation is going to happen soon. Briggs paused. It also means your property is about to become the least interesting thing on his agenda. Daniel looked out the window of his office at the yard where 2 of the older kids were chasing Marcus around a tree, while he laughed loud enough to be heard through the glass. The property, he said. Can we make it permanent? Is there a legal mechanism? There are several, Briggs said. We've been looking at them. Historic designation is one option. A conservation easement is another. A nonprofit land trust could hold the property in perpetuity. These are conversations we need to have with the full board, and we need to start having them now. While Caldwell is focused elsewhere, and before anyone else gets the idea of making a run at this land. Set up the meeting, Daniel said, whenever you can. End of the week. End of the week is fine. He hung up and sat for a moment. Then he stood up and went to the window and watched Marcus get caught and dissolve into laughter and squirm away and run again, and he thought we are going to be here for a very long time. Victor Caldwell received the visit on January 23rd. It was 2 investigators from the DA's office, not uniformed police, which would have been visible, which would have created a certain kind of story that no one at this stage wanted created prematurely. 2 investigators in plain clothes who arrived at his office building at 10 in the morning and were very polite and very thorough and presented with quiet efficiency a set of questions that Victor Caldwell's attorney Stephen Park, who had been called at 9:58 and arrived at 10:12, answered on his behalf. Victor Caldwell sat through the meeting with his face arranged in an expression of cooperative concern. He had done this before. He knew how to be cooperative without being confessional, how to answer questions without answering them, how to project calm when calm was the thing that mattered most. He projected calm until one of the investigators placed a document on the table. Caldwell looked at it. Park looked at it. Park turned slightly away from the investigators toward Caldwell, and his face did a thing that lawyers' faces almost never do in front of opposing parties. Caldwell looked at the document for a long moment. Then he looked up. I'd like to take a short break, he said. Of course, the investigator said pleasantly. In the hallway with the door closed, Park said one thing. Where did they get that? Caldwell didn't answer because Caldwell was running through every person who had ever had access to that particular record in that particular form with his particular authorization signature, and the list was very short, and every person on the list was someone whose loyalty he had been certain of, and now that certainty had the specific texture of something that had already broken. Victor, Park said. I need to think, Caldwell said. You need to do more than think. If that document is authentic, I know what it means if it's authentic. Then you need to tell me right now whether we're going to contest its authenticity or whether we're going to have a different kind of conversation. Caldwell looked at the wall. He was a man who had spent 30 years building things, hotels, condominiums, commercial developments, a reputation, a position in a town that had his name on its buildings and its benches and its hospital wing. He had built all of that through a combination of intelligence and ruthlessness in the specific gift of knowing when to advance and when to stop. He knew when to stop. Call the DA's office, and he said, tell them we'd like to discuss an arrangement. Park stared at him. Victor, we're not going to win this, Caldwell said flatly. Not with that document in their hands. If we fight it, we spend 2 years in litigation, and it ends the same way. I'm not doing 2 years of litigation. He turned and looked at Park directly. Call the DA's office. Tell them we're willing to talk about restitution, remediation, and full cooperation regarding the Hartfield and Dennison matters, in exchange for a reduction in charges. Park was quiet for a moment. The board is going to do what the board does. Deal with it. He turned and walked back toward the conference room and put his hand on the door. He thought briefly about a group of motorcycles rolling through a snowy street on Christmas morning. He thought about 23 children. He thought about what it cost to underestimate what people were willing to do for things that mattered to them. He pushed open the door and went back in. Daniel heard about Caldwell's decision to cooperate from Briggs on January 25th. I was standing in the storage building, again fully repaired, now smelling of fresh paint, the shelves straight and solid, doing a mundane inventory of donated supplies that had come in since the new year. He had a clipboard in one hand and a pen behind his ear, and he was counting boxes of winter boots when his phone rang. He's cooperating, Briggs said without preamble. Daniel stopped counting. Fully enough. He's agreed to plead to charges, pay full restitution for the damage to the orphanage, contribute to a remediation fund for the Hartfield Community Center and the Dennison Church, and cooperate with the investigation into the intermediary network he used. Daniel set the clipboard down on a shelf. The property. He's withdrawing all acquisition claims, all legal challenges, and all associated filings. In exchange, the DA agrees not to pursue the maximum charges and considers his cooperation as a mitigating factor. A brief pause. The property is yours, Daniel. He's done. Daniel stood in the storage building for a moment in the quiet. He had been in this building on Christmas Eve, 2 days after the destruction, standing in the wreckage with a flashlight, and the feeling he had then, that cold, absolute certainty of being beaten, was something he could still access precisely the way you can always access the exact texture of a fear that has been very real. What he felt now was not the opposite of that. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't even the particular light feeling of a burden being lifted, though that was part of it. It was more grounded than that, more specific. It was the feeling of looking at a building that had been wrecked and rebuilt and was now solid under your feet. It was the feeling of rooms that were going to keep being rooms. What happens next, he said. We file for historic designation next week. The land trust conversation is scheduled for Thursday. The DA's office will handle the criminal proceedings independently. You don't need to be involved in that unless you're called as a witness, which is possible but not certain. Briggs paused. From where I'm sitting, the next thing that happens is you go back to running your orphanage. Daniel almost laughed. I can do that. I imagine you can, Briggs said. You've been doing it for 11 years. He hung up and went back to counting winter boots. He told Jack that evening. Caldwell folded, he said. Yeah. Jack sounded unsurprised. You knew this was going to happen. I thought it might, Jack said. Man like that, he's not ideological. He's practical. Once the math stopped working in his favor, he was always going to recalculate. The document helped. Documents tend to. Daniel thought about the anonymous email, the string of letters, sender address, the forensic accountant's confirmation. He thought about the world that operated in the spaces between what was visible and what was official, the world where information could be found if you knew what questions to ask and who to ask them to. I'm not going to ask again how it happened, Daniel said. Good, Jack said, because I'd probably give you the same answer I gave you before. You found things that were hiding in places where things hide. Something like that. A pause. The property is secure. We're filing for historic designation next week. Good, do it fast. There are other developers. Caldwell won't be the last person who looks at 12 acres of riverfront and sees dollar signs. I know, Briggs is on it. A brief silence. Jack, Daniel said, can I ask you something that's not about the legal situation? You can ask. What made you get up that morning? I've thought about it a lot. You saw a 30-second news clip. You didn't know us. You didn't know the children. And you got up and you mobilized 40 people and changed everything. What was that? Jack was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Daniel wondered if he'd overstepped. Then Jack said, "You ever have a memory that's so old you don't know if it happened the way you remember it or if you just remember it that way because it's the thing that shaped everything after?" "Yes," Daniel said. "I was 9 years old," Jack said. "It was January. I was in a group home in Pittsburgh, and there was this, it doesn't matter the details. There was a situation, and I was cold, and I was scared, and I thought there was nobody coming. I thought that was the truth of the world. Nobody comes. You handle it yourself or you don't handle it. That's all there is." He stopped. "And then somebody came," Daniel said. "And then somebody came," Jack said. "And I've never forgotten what it felt like to be wrong about that. To think nobody was coming and have somebody come anyway." A pause. "I can't be 9 years old in a group home in Pittsburgh anymore, but I can be the person who comes. When I can be that." His voice was level and matter-of-fact the way voices are when they're describing something they've thought about carefully for a very long time. That's all it was. Daniel didn't say anything for a moment. "I think that's quite a lot, actually," he said. "Maybe," Jack said. "How are the kids?" "Emily's been teaching the younger ones a card game she invented. The rules change every day, and somehow she always wins." That sound again, almost a laugh, quiet and brief. "Smart kid," Jack said. "She asked me about you last week," Daniel said. "She asked if the man who brought Clara was going to come back." Silence. "What did you tell her?" Jack said. "I told her I didn't know, that I'd have to ask." Another silence. Different from the others, this one with something in it, some quality of decision. "Tell her probably," Jack said. Daniel smiled in the dark of his office. "Probably," he said. "I'll tell her probably." On the morning of January 28th, Victor Caldwell signed the papers. All of them. The restitution agreement, the withdrawal of the acquisition claims, the cooperation agreement with the DA's office, the contribution to the remediation fund. His attorney sat across the table and didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say. And Victor Caldwell signed page after page in the particular silence of a man reconciling himself to the distance between what he had intended and where he had ended up. The intermediary, a man named Frank DeLuca, who had run contracted work for Caldwell on 4 previous projects, was indicted 3 days later. His case would take considerably longer than Caldwell's to resolve. He was not as practical as his employer and intended to fight it, which was his right, and which would keep a number of lawyers employed well into the following year. Gary Letts pleaded guilty in February to criminal mischief and destruction of property and received a suspended sentence contingent on community service and restitution. He performed his community service without incident, apparently with some genuine remorse, which Daniel chose to take at face value because it cost him nothing, and because the alternative maintaining active anger at a man who was ultimately a hired instrument, rather than the source of the harm, seemed like a waste of energy he needed elsewhere. The historic designation application was filed on January 31st. The review process would take several months, but Briggs was confident, and in the meantime, the withdrawal of all Caldwell's claims gave the property a security it hadn't had in 8 months. The land trust paperwork was initiated in February. Hope Valley Children's Home began to breathe again. What Daniel hadn't expected, what none of them had expected, was what happened in the weeks after the news of Caldwell's cooperation became public. Christine Park ran a follow-up segment on January 29th. It laid out the resolution with the same clarity she'd brought to the original story, the guilty plea, the restitution, the property secured the 2 other communities receiving remediation, and it ended with 30 seconds of footage from Christmas morning. The motorcycles rolling in, children running down the steps, a brief shot of Emily Parker at the bottom of the steps looking up at something out of frame, holding a porcelain doll. The orphanage's donation line, which usually received perhaps 2 or 3 calls a week, received 97 calls in the 24 hours after the segment aired. Daniel stood at the front desk that evening with Margaret and looked at the log. 97, Margaret said. 97, Daniel confirmed, from where he ran his finger down the list. 17 states, he said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We're going to need more phone volunteers." He looked at the list again, at the names of people he didn't know from places he'd never been who had seen 30 seconds of footage of a little girl with a doll, and decided that this was the place they wanted to send their help. He thought about what Jack had said, "I can be the person who comes." There were a lot of people, it turned out, who wanted to be that person. They just needed to know where to go. Get the volunteers, Daniel said, and we're going to need a bigger storage building. Margaret looked at him. We just finished repairing the storage building. I know, Daniel said, but I think we're going to need more space. He was right. The calls kept coming for 3 weeks. The donations followed. A plumbing company from Ohio sent a crew in February to repair the aging pipes in the main building at no charge. A hardware store chain donated materials for a new playground structure. A woman in her 70s from Georgia sent a check with a note that said, I watched that little girl on television, and I just want her to know somebody cares. And Daniel had pinned that note to the bulletin board in his office, and it was still there. The world, it turned out, had a great deal of pent-up desire to do something that mattered. Hope Valley Children's Home had simply given it a place to land. Emily Parker turned 9 in February. Daniel organized a small birthday celebration cake, the card game she had invented, whose rules were still technically fluid, a movie in the common room. Margaret had ordered a book Emily had mentioned, wanting a thick one with a lighthouse on the cover. Karen made her favorite yellow cake with chocolate frosting, a combination that Emily maintained was the correct combination and that most of the other children concurred with. At the end of the evening, after most of the younger kids had gone to bed, Emily sat at the table with Daniel while he cleaned up. She had Clara in her lap. The one-eyed rabbit was upstairs on the pillow. Daniel, she said, yeah. Are we safe now? He stopped wiping the table and looked at her. She was watching him with those careful eyes, and he understood that she was asking a real question that deserved a real answer. Not the reassuring kind of answer that was designed to make a child feel better, rather than to tell them the truth. Yes, he said, the building is ours. Nobody can take it. The legal situation is resolved. The person who caused the problems is facing consequences, and he's out of our lives. She considered this. What about other people? Other people who might try? There are always going to be people who try to take things that aren't theirs, Daniel said. That's true for all of us. But now we have lawyers who are paying attention to this property, and we have documentation, and we have people in this community and beyond this community who know who we are and care what happens to us. He paused. We're not invisible anymore, Emily. That matters. She looked at Clara. She straightened the doll's dress with 2 careful fingers. Jack said somebody always comes, she said. He did. Do you believe that? Daniel thought about the question. He thought about 48 motorcycles on Christmas morning and an anonymous email with a damning document and 97 calls in 24 hours from 17 states and a woman in Georgia who just wanted a girl she'd never met to know that somebody cared. I do, he said. I believe it. Emily looked at him for a moment. Then she said with the black quiet certainty of someone who has decided to believe something and means it, me too. She picked up Clara and went to bed. Daniel finished cleaning up the table and turned off the light and walked the hallways of his building the way he did every night, checking doors and listening to the quiet, making sure everything was where it was supposed to be. Everything was where it was supposed to be. He turned off the last light and went to his office and sat for a moment in the dark before going home. And he thought about an 8-year-old girl sitting on a step in December with a piece of silver wrapping paper in her hand, and a 9-year-old girl going to bed in February with a porcelain doll and something in her face that had not been there before. Not certainty. Children don't get certainty. Nobody gets certainty. But something adjacent to it. Something that looked in the particular light of a hallway at the end of a birthday in a hard winter. A great deal like hope. Spring came to Silver Creek the way it always did, gradually, then all at once. The first week of March still had frost on the ground in the mornings, and then one day the temperature broke, and the kids at Hope Valley came home from school and went straight outside and didn't come back in until Karen stood at the door and called them in 4 times. And Daniel watched from his office window and thought, this is what the building is for. This is exactly what it's for. The historic designation application moved through the review process with fewer complications than Briggs had anticipated. By mid-March, the initial assessment had come back favorable. The land trust paperwork was progressing. The legal architecture that would protect Hope Valley's property in perpetuity was being constructed piece by people who were very good at building things that last. Victor Caldwell had, as far as Daniel could tell, largely retreated from public life. His company was restructuring, his investors were distracted, and his name had acquired the particular quality that names acquire when they've been attached to a news cycle that people associate with children's Christmas gifts being destroyed by hired thugs. His attorney had released a statement expressing regret for actions taken in the course of a business dispute that had, in his client's view, been mishandled by contractors operating beyond their authorized scope. It was the kind of statement that satisfied no one and convinced no one, but it was the kind of statement that served its purpose, which was to put something on the record that was not an admission. Daniel read the statement once and didn't read it again. He had other things to think about. The letter arrived on March 14th. It came in the regular mail, a standard white envelope with a Silver Creek postmark and no return address, addressed to Daniel Whitmore, Director, Hope Valley Children's Home. Daniel opened it at his desk, expecting another donation. They had been arriving with unusual frequency since the Christine Park segments, and found instead a single page typed with no letterhead. He read it. He read it again. Then he picked up his phone and called Briggs. "I received something today," he said. "I need you to tell me if it's what I think it is." He read it aloud. When he finished, there was a silence on Briggs's end that had a specific quality, not the silence of confusion, but the silence of someone processing something significant. "Read me the relevant section again," Briggs said. Daniel found the paragraph. He read, "It is the intention of the undersigned to establish a charitable trust in the amount of $480,000 to be held in perpetuity for the operational and capital needs of Hope Valley Children's Home, Silver Creek, subject to the condition that said organization maintains its nonprofit status and continues to serve children in the foster care system. The trust shall be administered by a board of trustees to be established in consultation with the organization's current leadership." He stopped reading. $480,000, Briggs said. "Yes. And the undersigned is—" "There's no signature," Daniel said. "The letter is typed, and there's no signature, and there's no return address." A very long silence. "Is this a joke?" Daniel said. "It doesn't read like a joke," Briggs said. "It reads like a lawyer drafted it. The language is correct. The structure is correct. This is not a joke, Daniel." He paused. "But we can't accept it as written. If we're going to establish a trust of this size, it has to be done properly. There has to be a named trustee, a formal trust document, all the legal architecture. Whoever sent this knows that, which suggests they sent it as a first communication, not a final one." "They're going to follow up," Daniel said. "I would expect so." "Do you have any idea?" "Several," Briggs said, "but I'd rather not speculate out loud about something this significant until I know more." A pause. "Does anyone else know about this letter?" "No, I found it in the mail this morning." "Keep it that way for now. Bring me the original. I want to look at it." Daniel put the letter in an envelope and drove it to Briggs's office himself. He called Jack that night. Not about the letter. Briggs had asked him to keep it quiet, and he kept it quiet. He called about something else. Or he thought he was calling about something else. He wasn't entirely sure anymore where the something else ended and the letter began. "Spring's coming," he said when Jack picked up. "Yeah," Jack said. He sounded like he was outside. There was wind in the background. "I wanted to ask if maybe you'd want to come by the orphanage sometime. Not for a reason, just to see how things are." A brief pause. "You said Emily asked about me." "She asks about you every couple of weeks, not in a demanding way. Just she checks." Jack was quiet for a moment. "She doing all right?" "She's doing better than all right. She started reading at 2 grade levels above her age. Her teacher called last week to tell me. Said she gets through a book every few days and comes back asking for more." Daniel paused. "She's been reading to the younger ones at night. Makes up different voices for all the characters. The little ones love it." He heard something in the background shift, the wind maybe, or the quality of the silence around it. "Yeah," Jack said. "I'll come by. When I can. Don't make a thing of it." "I won't make a thing of it. I mean it, Whitmore. Don't tell the kids, don't put it on the calendar. I'll just show up." "That," Daniel said, "seems to be how you operate." A quiet sound that was almost a laugh. "Get some sleep," Jack said. "You sound tired." "I am tired," Daniel said. "It's a good tired, though." "Yeah," Jack said. "That's the right kind." The follow-up to the anonymous letter came 9 days later. It came by phone to Daniel's direct line at 8:15 in the morning. He recognized the voice before the man identified himself, because he had spent enough time in Briggs's office by now to have met most of the lawyers in Silver Creek's legal community, and the voice belonged to a man named Robert Farrell, who was a partner at a firm on the north end of town and whom Daniel associated primarily with estate planning and corporate work, and who had never, as far as Daniel knew, had any connection to Hope Valley. "Mr. Whitmore," Farrell said, "I believe you received a letter 2 weeks ago." Daniel sat up straight. "I did. I drafted that letter on behalf of a client who prefers to remain anonymous. I'm calling to discuss the next steps if you are willing." "I'm willing. My client is prepared to establish the trust as described with full legal documentation, independent trustees, and a structured disbursement schedule. The total amount would be $480,000 contributed over 5 years, with an initial disbursement of $100,000 upon execution of the trust agreement." Daniel's hand tightened on the phone. "I see," he said very carefully. "There is one condition beyond the operational ones described in the letter." "What condition?" Farrell paused. "The trust is to be established in the name of Clara." Daniel was still. "Just Clara," Farrell said. "My client was specific about that. Not a last name, not a family name. Just Clara, the Clara Trust for Hope Valley Children's Home." The porcelain doll with the blue dress, propped against the headboard next to a one-eyed rabbit named by a girl who had said she used to be lost, but now she's home. Daniel set the phone down on his desk for exactly 4 seconds, because he needed 4 seconds to make sure his voice was going to come out correctly. He picked it up. "Tell your client," he said, "that we accept." Farrell said, "I'll draw up the documents." Daniel hung up the phone and sat at his desk and did not move for 2 full minutes. Then he called Briggs. "I just got a call from Robert Farrell," he said. Briggs said, "And so, the trust is real and it's moving forward, and I need to know right now, Alan, do you know who this is?" A pause, a careful pause. "The trust is to be called the Clara Trust," Daniel said. The client insisted on that name specifically, Clara, a name that means exactly one thing to exactly one person in Silver Creek. Another pause. "Alan," Daniel said, "I have a professional obligation not to speculate about another attorney's client," Briggs said in a tone of voice that was speculating very loudly indeed. "Can you call Farrell?" "I can. Can you ask him professionally, colleague to colleague, whether the trust instrument references any connection to events last December?" "I can ask that," Briggs said, "though I think you and I both already know the answer." Daniel thought about Jack Reynolds sitting on the step at the bottom of the orphanage stairs, looking up at Emily with her rabbit and her piece of silver wrapping paper. He thought about Jack saying somebody always comes. He thought about 41 motorcycles and 4 pickup trucks, and a man who had grown up in a group home in Pittsburgh and decided somewhere along the way that he was going to be the person who shows up. I thought about what $480,000 did to the long-term survival of a children's home that had spent 11 years operating on the edge of what was sustainable. "You're right," Daniel said. "I think I know the answer." Jack showed up on a Saturday in late March. He came alone, no convoy, no trucks, just his motorcycle parked on River Road and him at the front door in his jacket with his helmet under his arm. And he had told Daniel not to make a thing of it, so Daniel had not made a thing of it, which lasted approximately 45 seconds after Jack walked through the door. Marcus found him first. Marcus was 6 and had no fear of anyone, and had retained from Christmas morning a very specific memory of a large man who had handed him a remote-controlled car and whose name he had subsequently asked about 11 times. He came around the corner at full speed, saw Jack skidded to a stop and said, "You came back." Jack looked down at him. "Yeah." "Did you bring the remote control car?" "Marcus," Daniel said from the hallway. "I'm asking," Marcus said reasonably. Jack crouched down to Marcus's level. "I didn't bring a car today, but I brought something." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a pack of cards. "You know how to play gin rummy?" Marcus stared at the cards with intense suspicion. "No, but yeah." "You want to learn?" Marcus considered this for approximately 1 second. "Yeah," he said. "Go find us a table," Jack said. Marcus took off at the same speed he'd arrived at, already calling ahead to whoever was in the common room that they needed a table. Jack stood up and looked at Daniel. "I thought you didn't want a thing made of this," Daniel said. "I said don't tell the kids. You didn't tell them." He shrugged. "They found me on their own. Different thing." Daniel almost smiled. "Emily is in the library," he said. "She doesn't know you're here." Jack nodded. Let me get Marcus set up first. He spent 40 minutes in the common room teaching Marcus gin rummy. By the 20-minute mark, 3 other children had materialized and demanded to be taught, and Jack dealt them all in without comment. And Daniel watched from the doorway as a man whose reputation could clear a room sat on the floor of a children's common room and patiently explained for the 4th time the difference between a run and a set. Calhoun, who had come with Jack on Christmas morning and had since developed something of a habit of finding reasons to be in Silver Creek, appeared at the front door around noon with a bag from the diner down the street containing sandwiches for everyone. He had not been invited and had apparently not needed to be. He texted me, Calhoun said when Daniel looked at him. Jack did. He said he was coming by and I should bring lunch. Calhoun handed over the bag. So I brought lunch. Daniel took the bag. You drove 40 minutes to bring sandwiches. Calhoun shrugged the way a man shrugs when he's done something that he finds entirely unremarkable. Kids gotta eat, he said to him. Emily found Jack at 1 o'clock. She had come downstairs from the library. She went there on Saturday mornings without fail, a habit she had developed in her first week at Hope Valley and maintained with the consistency of someone who had decided that books were a thing she was going to be serious about. And she stopped in the doorway of the common room and saw him sitting at the card table with Marcus and 2 others, and she stood there for a moment. Jack looked up. They looked at each other across the common room. Hi, Emily said. Hi, Jack said. You said probably, she said. I did. She came into the room. She sat down at the table. She looked at the cards. What are you playing? Gin rummy, Marcus said with the authority of someone who has been playing for 45 minutes and feels this confers expertise. Can I play? Jack dealt her in without a word. She won the first hand in 6 minutes, which made Marcus loudly incredulous. She won the second hand in 8 minutes, which made Jack look at her with a sideways attention that was not quite surprise, but close to it. You've played this before, he said. My mom taught me, she said. She said it simply the way she said most things, not as if it didn't hurt, but as if the hurt was a thing she had decided not to perform. Jack nodded. She teach you to count cards too. Emily looked at him. You're not supposed to count cards. No, Jack agreed, but some people do. Are you asking if I am? I'm asking if you know how. A very brief pause. No, she said. Then can you? Jack almost smiled. Deal the next hand, he said. They played for another hour. Marcus lost track of how many hands Emily won and started making up numbers that he felt were more satisfying. Calhoun sat in the corner eating his sandwich and watching with the expression of a man who finds something genuinely entertaining. Daniel stood in the doorway long enough to confirm that everything was completely fine and then went to his office and did 2 hours of work he'd been putting off for a week because it was easier to focus when the building felt like this, full and warm and fully itself. Then, at 3 o'clock, Jack found him. He knocked on the open office door and leaned against the frame. I need to tell you something, Jack said. Daniel set down his pen. Okay. Jack came in. He sat in the chair across from Daniel's desk, the chair that Briggs had sat in, that board members sat in, that worried parents and social workers sat in. He sat the way he sat on his motorcycle with an ease that was not quite relaxation, but had the quality of it. The trust, Jack said. Daniel was quiet. Farrell called me, Jack said. He told me you'd received the follow-up and accepted. He called you, Daniel said. He's my attorney, Jack said. Has been for 10 years. Daniel sat back in his chair. He had known he had been fairly certain, but knowing and having it confirmed were different things. $480,000, he said, over 5 years. Jack, it's money, Jack said. I have money. I have more money than you probably think I have because people in my world tend to carry a certain image, and people's assumptions about that image don't always correspond to reality. He said it without vanity or defensiveness, just as a fact. I've been looking for a long time for a right place to put some of it. This is a right place. This is an extraordinary amount. It's enough to run this place properly for a long time with some capital improvements. That's what I wanted to do. He paused. The name was important to me, Clara, not my name on it, not anything that draws attention to where it came from. Just Clara. Daniel thought about a 9-year-old girl saying she used to be lost, but now she's home. She's going to figure it out eventually, Daniel said. Emily is not a child who misses things. I know, Jack said. When she's old enough to understand it properly, you can tell her. I'll leave that to your judgment. He shifted in the chair. I don't want it to be a thing. I don't want her to feel I don't know, like she owes me something. Like Christmas morning was a transaction. It wasn't a transaction. No, but gifts can get complicated when they're big enough, I know that. Daniel looked at him for a long moment, at the weathered face and the dark eyes and the jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something hard. At the man who had gotten up at 5 in the morning on Christmas Day and made one decision that had changed the trajectory of 23 children's lives. Why didn't you tell me who you were from the beginning, Daniel said. What do you mean? When you called, when you came, you let me think you were just a man who saw a news story and responded. You didn't tell me about the network, you have the resources, the attorney, any of it. Jack was quiet for a moment. Because I didn't come as those things, he said. I came because a bunch of kids needed Christmas, and I had the means to make that happen. The rest of it, he paused. The rest of it developed because the situation developed. If Caldwell had folded in January and walked away, you would never have needed to know anything beyond Christmas morning. The rest of it happened because it needed to happen. And the trust. The trust happened because 12 acres of riverfront property in a growing town is always going to attract someone. Caldwell was the first. He won't be the last. The best protection this place has is not legal designation, it's being obviously, visibly, financially sustainable. An orphanage that operates on the edge of solvency is a target. An orphanage with an endowment and a land trust and community visibility is not. He said it simply. That's strategy, not charity. It's both, Daniel said. Jack didn't argue with that. There's something else, Daniel said. Jack looked at him. The board wants to acknowledge the contribution publicly. Not the source I've told them. The trust is anonymous, and that's final. Final. But the trust itself, the Clara Trust, is going to be public record when it's established. The community is going to know that Hope Valley has a named endowment fund. Daniel paused. And Christine Park is going to want to do a follow-up segment. Jack's expression did the thing it did when he was deciding something. Fine, he said. On the trust, fine. I don't care about public record. I care about the source staying quiet. Farrell will ensure that. Good, Daniel hesitated. She might try to find out where it came from, Park. She's thorough. Let her try, Jack said. It was not a threat, it was said with the equanimity of someone who had long practice in the art of not being found when he didn't want to be found. Christine Park's third segment ran on April 2nd. It was 8 minutes and it covered the establishment of the Clara Trust, the anonymous endowment for Hope Valley Children's Home, and the progress on the historic designation. And it included a brief interview with Daniel that was, he felt, the most honest 8 minutes of television he had ever participated in. Park asked him, what does this mean for the future of Hope Valley? He looked at the camera and said, it means we're going to be here. Whatever happens, whoever comes and goes, whatever the town looks like in 10 years or 20 years, we're going to be here. And the children who need us are going to have somewhere to come. Park asked, how did this happen? How does an orphanage that was nearly destroyed on Christmas Eve end up in a stronger position in 4 months than it has been in 11 years? Daniel thought for a moment about how to answer that. I thought about a phone ringing at 6:47 in the morning and a rough voice saying, give me the address. He thought about a man who had grown up in a group home in Pittsburgh and decided that being the person who comes was worth something. He thought about 41 motorcycles and a forensic accountant and a woman in Georgia who just wanted a little girl to know that somebody cared. Someone showed up, he said, and then other people showed up. And the thing about people showing up is that it tends to be contagious. Park looked at him. She had the expression of a journalist who understood that she was not going to get the full story today and had made peace with it. The Clara Trust, she said. Can you tell us where the name comes from? Daniel smiled. A little girl named her doll Clara, he said. And I think whoever established the trust thought that was the right name for something that's supposed to last. Jack came by twice more in April. The first time he came alone on a Tuesday afternoon and spent 90 minutes helping Tom with a plumbing issue in the East Wing that Tom had been wrestling with for 2 weeks. He had apparently a working knowledge of plumbing that surprised Tom considerably and that Jack offered no explanation for. The problem was fixed. Tom was grateful in the particular way that men are grateful when another man helps them solve a technical problem without making them feel bad about having needed help. The second time he came with 4 of his crew on a Saturday, and they helped Marcus and 2 of the older boys build a raised garden bed in the yard, a project that had been on the orphanage's wish list for 2 years and that had lacked only the labor to get started. By the end of the afternoon, there were 3 raised beds framed and filled and planted with seeds that the children had selected from a catalog with an intensity that suggested they had opinions about vegetables, which several of them did. Emily sat on the back step and watched the construction with Clara in her lap, and occasionally offered observations about structural integrity that were, Calhoun noted privately to Jack, not wrong. "She's watching everything," Calhoun said. "She's always watching everything," Jack said. He was driving a stake into the ground with a mallet. "She was doing that in December." "You think she knows?" Jack looked across the yard at Emily, who was saying something to Marcus about the spacing of the tomato plants that Marcus was pretending not to listen to, while visibly adjusting the spacing. "Not yet," Jack said, "but she will." The twist that Daniel had not seen coming arrived on April 15th. He was in his office at 4 in the afternoon when Margaret knocked and opened the door without waiting, which she only did when something was either very good or very bad. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "A woman. She says she's Emily's family." Daniel went completely still. "What?" "She says her name is Caroline Gaines. She says she's Emily's maternal aunt." Margaret's voice was careful and measured. "She says she didn't know Emily existed until 3 weeks ago." Daniel stood up. "Where is she?" "The front room." "Keep Emily with the other kids. Don't say anything to her." He came around his desk. "Has she shown any documentation?" "She has an envelope." He went to the front room. Caroline Gaines was somewhere in her mid-40s. She looked enough like Emily's mother, who Daniel had seen in photographs in the file, that the resemblance landed as a physical shock before he had time to process it. She had the same coloring, the same careful way of sitting, the same quality of watchfulness in her eyes that Emily had, the watchfulness of someone who had learned early to read rooms. She stood up when he came in. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I know this must be alarming. I want you to know I have documentation. I'm not here to cause problems. I'm here because I just found out I have a niece." Daniel looked at her. He was measuring everything, her expression, her posture, the envelope she held, the slight tremor in her hands that was not calculation, but something more like barely managed emotion. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me everything." She sat. She told him. Caroline Gaines had been estranged from her sister Emily's mother, Rebecca, for 14 years, a falling out that had started over something she described as stupid and young and had calcified over time into something neither of them knew how to cross. She had known Rebecca had a child. She had not known the child's name or age or anything specific about her. She had not reached out because she had convinced herself over 14 years that Rebecca wouldn't want her to. When Rebecca died in October, the death notice had been small and quiet and in the local paper of a town 2 states away. Carolyn had seen it 3 weeks ago, forwarded by a mutual acquaintance who thought she should know. She had seen it and had sat with it for 3 days and then had hired a lawyer to find out what she could, and the lawyer had found Emily, and the lawyer had found Hope Valley Children's Home, and the lawyer had found Daniel Whitmore. "I'm not here to disrupt her life," Caroline said. "I know she doesn't know me. I know I have no right to walk in here and expect anything." Her voice was even, but the evenness was costing her something. I need to see her. I need to know she's all right." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. He had been a director for 11 years. He had dealt with family situations of every variety, the complicated, the painful, the joyful, and the ugly. He had developed over that time a sense for the difference between someone performing a feeling and someone having one. Caroline Gaines was having one. "I'll need to verify your documentation," he said, "and I'll need to involve Emily's caseworker. And most importantly, I will need to talk to Emily herself before any introduction happens." He paused. "She's 9 years old and she's been through an enormous amount since October. Her well-being comes first. Do you understand that?" "Yes," Caroline said immediately. "Absolutely yes. This process will take time. It may take several weeks. There will be supervised visits before any other arrangement is discussed." "I understand. And if at any point Emily says she doesn't want to proceed, we stop." "Of course." Daniel looked at the envelope. "May I see the documentation?" She handed it over. He looked through it. Birth certificates, a DNA testing request, already filed family photos. One photograph stopped him. It showed a young woman, Caroline, maybe 25, around the age she would have been when she and Rebecca lost contact holding a baby. On the back, in someone's handwriting, Rebecca and baby Emily, Christmas morning. Emily at perhaps 3 months old in the arms of an aunt, she had no memory of on a Christmas morning that had preceded by 9 years another Christmas morning that had changed everything. Daniel set the photograph down carefully. "I'll be in touch," he said, within a week. He called Jack that evening, not because Jack was Emily's guardian or had any legal standing in the situation, but because Jack had sat on the step with Emily in December and said somebody always comes, and because Daniel needed to say the next thing out loud to someone who would understand it. "She has family," Daniel said. A silence. "A maternal aunt. Estranged from the mother for years, didn't know Emily existed in any real way until last month." He paused. "She seems genuine. The documentation is in order. She's not asking for anything, not yet. She just wants to meet her." "What does Emily know?" Jack said. "Nothing yet. I have to tell her." "How do you think she'll take it?" Daniel thought about Emily Parker. He thought about the careful eyes and the way she asked real questions and expected real answers. He thought about the watchfulness that was not suspicion, but something older. The watchfulness of a child who has learned to look at the world clearly, because looking at it clearly is the only protection available. He thought about what Emily had said in February. "Somebody always comes." "I don't know," Daniel said honestly. "She might be overwhelmed. She might be guarded. She might—" He stopped. "I think she'll ask a lot of questions." "That's what she does," Jack said. "Yes." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure what the right outcome is here. I don't know if family a stranger who is technically family is better for her than what she has here. She's stable. She's thriving. She's—" "Whitmore," Jack said. "You know what the right question is." Daniel stopped. "The right question is what Emily wants," Jack said. "Not what's comfortable, and not what's efficient, and not what any of the adults around her think is best." "What does Emily want?" He paused. "Ask her. Trust her answer." Daniel sat with that. "She's 9, he said. "She's Emily," Jack said. "That's not the same thing." He was right. Daniel hung up and sat in his office in the quiet of the building around him. The sounds of 23 children settling into the evening. The distant sound of Marcus laughing at something. The sound of Karen's voice in the hallway asking someone if they'd brushed their teeth. He thought about the photograph on his desk. Emily at 3 months old on a Christmas morning, a long time ago, in the arms of someone who had been lost to her and was now perhaps not lost anymore. "I thought somebody always comes." He thought about what it would mean for Emily if that was true, not just at Christmas, not just in emergencies, but in the ordinary ongoing duration of a life. What it would mean to have someone who had been looking for you without knowing they were looking, who had found you finally by a chain of coincidence and grief and a mutual acquaintance, and a lawyer who had driven to Silver Creek and sat in a front room with documentation and trembling hands and said, "I just need to see her." He sat there a long time. Then he got up and went to find Emily. She was in the library, where she always was at this hour, cross-legged on the window seat with a book open on her lap and Clara propped against the cushion beside her. She looked up when he came in. She looked at his face the way she always looked at his face, reading it, measuring it, figuring out what the adults were really thinking. "Something happened," she said. "Yes," he said. He sat down across from her. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen all the way through before you ask questions. Can you do that?" She closed her book. She folded her hands on top of it. "Yes," she said. He told her. He watched her face as he talked. He watched it very carefully, the way she always watched other people's faces, trying to read it, to measure it, to understand what was really happening underneath the words. When he finished, the room was quiet. Emily looked at her hands. She looked at Clara. Then she looked up at Daniel and asked the question he had been waiting for, the question that would tell him better than anything else exactly what she was thinking. "Does she know about Clara?" Emily said. Daniel blinked. "Of all the questions." "I know. I don't think so. It's not something she would know about." Emily considered this. "When I meet her," she said, "I want to tell her about Clara, about where the name came from." She paused. "Is that okay?" Daniel looked at this 9-year-old girl who had been lost and found and was still, in the most important ways, exactly herself. "Yes," he said. "That's more than okay." Emily picked up her book again. She opened it to the page she'd been on. Then she said, without looking up, "Can I meet her on a Saturday? I don't like missing school." Daniel almost laughed. "Yes, Emily," he said. "We can make it a Saturday." Part 5. The first meeting between Emily Parker and Caroline Gaines happened on a Saturday in late April in the front room of Hope Valley Children's Home at 10 o'clock in the morning. Daniel had prepared for it the way he prepared for everything that mattered, carefully, methodically, and with the specific anxiety of someone who understood that careful and methodical were not the same as guaranteed. He had spoken with Emily's caseworker twice. He had spoken with a child psychologist who had been working with Emily since November. He had spoken with Briggs about the legal framework and what supervised visitation meant in practice, and what the pathway would look like depending on how things developed. Han had spoken with Emily 4 more times in the week before the meeting, each time giving her an opportunity to say she had changed her mind, each time watching her face and listening for hesitation. There was no hesitation. There was something more interesting than that. There was preparation. Emily Parker, 9 years old, was preparing to meet her aunt the way she prepared for tests at school, which was to say thoroughly and without visible fear, though Daniel knew by now that lack of visible fear was not the same as lack of fear. On Friday evening, he knocked on the door of the library where she was reading. "Tomorrow," he said. "I know," she said. "How are you feeling?" She looked at her book for a moment, then she looked up. What if she's not? What if she's not like I'm imagining? What are you imagining? I don't know exactly. She was quiet. I'm imagining someone who looks like my mom, and I don't know if that's going to feel good or bad. Daniel sat down across from her. It might feel like both at the same time, he said. That's allowed. She considered this. Okay, she said. Then, will you be in the room? The whole time. I won't leave unless you ask me to. She nodded once. She picked up her book. Good night, Daniel, she said. Good night, Emily. He pulled the door to its usual angle and went down the hall, and he thought, she is the most remarkable person I have encountered in 11 years of this work. And she is 9 years old, and tomorrow is either going to be the beginning of something extraordinary or a thing she is going to have to recover from, and there is no way to know which until it happens. He didn't sleep well. Caroline arrived at 9:55, 5 minutes early, which Daniel noted because punctuality in this context felt like information. She was wearing a blue sweater, and she had clearly thought carefully about that, the same way she had clearly thought carefully about everything about her posture when she sat down, about the way she held her hands, about the fact that she had brought nothing with her, no gifts, no offerings, nothing that could be read as an attempt to purchase goodwill. She had understood, without being told, that this was not a situation where things could be purchased. How is she? Carolyn asked when Daniel came in. She's ready, he said. She's been ready since Tuesday. Caroline's hands tightened slightly in her lap. I don't know if that makes me feel better or worse. Both, Daniel said. In my experience, the right answer to that kind of question is usually both. Carolyn looked at him. She sounds like a complicated kid. She's the clearest person I've ever met, Daniel said. She just doesn't waste clarity on things that don't deserve it. Carolyn was quiet for a moment. That was Rebecca, she said softly. Rebecca was like that. The door opened. Emily stood in the doorway. She was wearing the blue cardigan she wore on days she considered important, and she had Clara tucked under her left arm, and she was looking at Caroline the way she looked at everything carefully without performance, taking a direct measurement. Caroline looked at Emily. The resemblance went both ways. Daniel had noticed it when he looked at Caroline, but seeing them in the same room made it something else entirely. The same coloring, the same quality of stillness, the same watchfulness in the eyes that was not suspicion, but something older and more careful than suspicion. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Emily walked into the room and sat down on the couch across from Caroline and set Clara on her knee and said, "You look like my mom." Caroline's breath caught. It was barely audible, but Daniel heard it. "I know," Caroline said. "We were very alike when we were young." Emily looked at her steadily. "Why didn't I know about you?" It was the first question, the real one, not the warm-up, and it landed with the directness that Emily always brought to real questions, the directness that did not intend to wound, but did not soften itself to avoid the possibility. Caroline had clearly prepared for this. Daniel watched her take one breath, just one, and then answer. "Because your mom and I had a fight a long time ago," she said, "and we were both too stubborn and too proud to fix it. And years went by and the gap got bigger and we didn't fix it then either. And then," she stopped. "And then it was too late to fix it. And I am sorry for that every single day." Emily looked at her. "What was the fight about?" "Something stupid," Caroline said. "Something that felt big at the time and was actually very small, the way most fights are." She paused. I was 28 years old and I made a decision that I thought was right and your mom thought was wrong, and instead of talking about it, we stopped talking altogether. That was a mistake. It was my mistake as much as hers. Emily was quiet for a moment. She didn't talk about you, Emily said. She didn't say she had a sister. I know. Caroline's voice was steady, but the steadiness was working hard. I think that was hard for her. I think she didn't know how to explain it without explaining the whole thing, and the whole thing was painful. She looked at Emily directly. But you should know she did not talk about you. I found out through someone we both knew that Rebecca had a daughter named Emily, and that she was very proud of you, and that she said you were the smartest person she knew. And she was counting the years until you were old enough to run the world. Something moved across Emily's face, fast and deep and then controlled, not suppressed, but brought to order by the specific discipline of a child who has been keeping herself together for 6 months and knows how. Okay, Emily said. Her voice was even. I'm sorry, Caroline said. I'm sorry I wasn't there before now. I'm sorry your mom and I wasted 14 years. I'm sorry I didn't know where you were in October and that you've been here without anyone. She stopped. I don't expect anything. I want you to know that. I'm not here to disrupt your life or take you away from people you trust. I needed to find you. I needed to know you were all right. Emily looked at her for a long moment. Then she held out Clara. Caroline looked at the doll. This is Clara, Emily said. There's a trust fund named after her, named after this doll. Somebody who cared about me created it and they named it Clara. Because that's her name. She paused. I want you to know about her. Because she's important. Caroline took the doll very carefully with both hands. She looked at it. She looked up at Emily. Tell me about her, Caroline said. And Emily Parker, 9 years old, who had arrived at Hope Valley Children's Home in October with a canvas tote bag and a library book and a one-eyed rabbit, began to talk. The first supervised visit lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, Emily and Caroline were sitting side by side on the couch, and Caroline was looking at photographs on Emily's phone pictures. Emily had taken over the winter of the garden beds being built of Marcus, losing at gin rummy of Clara in various positions that Emily had documented with the seriousness of a naturalist recording field data. Daniel sat in the corner and was not needed, which was the best outcome available. When Caroline left, she shook Daniel's hand at the door. Thank you, she said. She did the work, Daniel said. She always does. Caroline looked back at the room where Emily had returned to her book. I want to do this right, she said. Whatever right looks like, I don't need it to be fast. That's the right answer, Daniel said. Will you tell me if I'm doing something wrong? If I say something I shouldn't, if I push too hard? I will. She nodded. She went down the steps and got in her car and sat there for a moment before starting it, and Daniel watched from the door and understood that she was doing the specific thing you do when you've been holding something together for 2 hours and can finally let it be less held. He went back inside. Emily was in the library. She had Clara in her lap and the rabbit beside her and her book open, and when Daniel appeared in the doorway, she looked up. She's going to come back, Emily said. It was not a question. Yes. Good, Emily said, and went back to her book. May arrived, and the garden beds produced actual vegetables, which struck the children as nearly miraculous. Marcus took personal credit for the tomatoes, despite having planted only 2 of the seeds. Emily maintained detailed notes about the growth rate of the bean plants that she had been updating weekly since April, and that she shared with nobody but consulted often. The Clara Trust was formally established on May 7th. The documentation was completed, the trustees were named, the first disbursement was scheduled. Briggs called Daniel at noon to confirm, and Daniel walked out to the garden and stood in the spring air and thought, we are going to be here. The historic designation came through on May 19th. It arrived in the form of a letter from the State Preservation Office, and Daniel read it standing at the front desk and then sat down on the bench in the hallway because his legs suggested that would be wise. Tom came out of the maintenance room and found him there. Good news or bad news, Tom said. Daniel handed him the letter. Tom read it. He read it again. He put it down and looked at the wall for a moment. We should tell the kids, Tom said. We should, Daniel agreed. They told the kids at dinner. Daniel stood up at the end of the meal and explained in the kind of language that was honest without being complicated what historic designation meant and what it didn't mean and why it mattered. Marcus listened carefully and then said, so nobody can knock it down. Nobody can knock it down, Daniel confirmed. Marcus nodded with deep satisfaction. Good, he said. I like it here. Several of the older kids laughed. Emily, who was sitting at the end of the table with Clara propped against her milk glass, did not laugh but smiled in the particular way she smiled when something confirmed something she had already expected. The call came in June. Jack was in his truck when his phone rang. The number was one he didn't immediately recognize, and he almost let it go to voicemail. And then something made him pick it up. Reynolds, he said, a pause. Then, this is Caroline Gaines. I'm Emily Parker's aunt. Jack said nothing for a moment. Then, okay. I got your number from Daniel Whitmore. I hope that's all right. What do you need? Another pause, the pause of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say and is now finding the rehearsal inadequate. I wanted to thank you, she said, for Christmas, for what you did for Emily. She told me about it. She tells me a lot, actually. She's been talking to me for 2 months now, and she told me about Christmas morning, about the doll, about what you said to her. Jack was quiet. She said you told her somebody always comes, Caroline said. She said she thinks about that a lot. A pause. I wasn't there in October when she needed someone. I wasn't there, and you were, and I wanted you to know that somebody noticed, that it mattered, that you being there on Christmas morning is part of why she's who she is right now. Jack sat in his truck and looked at the road ahead of him. How is she? He said. She's extraordinary, Caroline said, and her voice caught on the last word. She's reading college-level books, and she invented a card game with shifting rules, and she takes notes on her garden, and she names everything. She's extraordinary, and she's mine, and I almost missed her entirely. But you didn't, Jack said. No. A breath. No, I didn't. A pause. She asks about you. She asks if you're coming by again. Tell her probably, Jack said. A short silence, then, she said you'd say that. And for the first time in a long time, Jack Reynolds laughed. Not the almost laugh, not the shape of one. An actual laugh, brief, real, and surprised out of him by a 9-year-old girl who had been right about what he was going to say before he said it. Smart kid, he said. She really is, Caroline said. The twist that Jack had not seen coming arrived at the end of June. It came in the form of a letter addressed to him at the clubhouse, which was unusual enough on its own. Most people who needed to reach him did not reach him by mail. The return address was a law office in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He opened it. He read it. He sat down. He read it again. The letter was from an attorney handling the estate of a man named Gerald Mercer, who had died in March at the age of 79, and who had been, Jack read the relevant section, 3 times the director of a group home in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the late 1970s and early 1980s. A man who had, according to the letter, spent the last decade of his life attempting to locate former residents of the home and ensure they were all right, and who had, in his final years, established a small bequest for each former resident he had managed to locate. The amount in the bequest was not large. That was not the point. The point was the letter attached behind the legal document, handwritten on lined paper in the careful handwriting of someone who had written it slowly and meant every word. Jack, the letter began. I don't know if this will reach you or if you'll want to read it if it does, but I've been carrying something for a long time and I'd like to set it down. He read the letter. He read it twice. Then he folded it very carefully, put it back in the envelope, and sat with it in his hands for a while. Gerald Mercer had been the director of the group home in Pittsburgh in 1978, the year a 9-year-old boy named Jack Reynolds had arrived there cold and scared and certain that nobody was going to come. Gerald Mercer had been the man who came. He had been, Jack read the phrase in the letter again, the man who turned the lights on in January and made sure there was food and made sure the heat was working and made sure that a boy who had decided the world did not care whether he lived or died. Understood slowly over the years he spent in that home that there was at least one person in it who was paying attention. Jack had not known Gerald Mercer's name. He had been 9 and then 12 and then 15 and then 18 and gone. And Gerald Mercer had been in his memory simply the director, the adult, the presence, the man who came. He had not known until this moment that the man had spent years looking for former residents. He had not known that Gerald Mercer had died in March. He had not known, could not have known, that what he had done on Christmas morning when getting up and making calls and driving to a children's home in Silver Creek was a thing that Gerald Mercer would have understood in his bones. He sat with the letter. He thought about what he had told Daniel, the question Daniel had asked about why he had gotten up that morning and made that call. He thought about what he had said, somebody came for me, and I've never forgotten what it felt like to be wrong about nobody coming. I thought about a 79-year-old man in Pittsburgh spending his last years writing letters to people he had once tried to help, wanting to know if they were all right. He thought about a man who had turned the lights on in January and asked no recognition for it and received none, and still thought about the people he tried to help and wanted them to be all right. He picked up his phone and called Daniel. "You okay?" Daniel said when he heard Jack's voice, because he could hear something in it. "I got a letter today," Jack said. "From who?" Jack was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "From the person who came for me a long time ago." He paused. "He died in March. He left me a small amount of money and a letter." He said. Jack stopped. He said he always wondered how I turned out. Daniel was quiet. "I want to do something," Jack said. "I want to do something with the money he left. I don't want it sitting in an account." "What do you want to do with it?" Jack thought about Emily Parker naming her doll Clara. He thought about the Clara Trust and what it meant to name something after a 9-year-old's doll. He thought about Marcus's absolute certainty that "I like it here" was sufficient justification for a building's existence. He thought about Gerald Mercer writing letters to former residents who were now adults, wanting to know if they were all right. "I want to put it in the garden," Jack said. "The raised beds. I want to use it to expand them. Add more growing space, teach the kids how to sustain it themselves." He paused. "And I want to put up a small sign, nothing big, just I want to name it." "What do you want to name it?" "The Gerald Mercer Garden," Jack said. "Nobody's going to know who that is. But I'll know, and someday maybe I'll tell Emily about it, and she'll add it to her notes." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said very simply, "Yes, let's do that." The Gerald Mercer Garden was completed in July. Tom built the additional raised beds over 2 weekends with help from Calhoun and 2 others, and Emily supervised the planting with the authority of someone who had been doing this for 3 months and had strong opinions about plant spacing that had proved consistently correct. The sign was small, simple wooden board, painted green with the name burned into it cleanly. Jack put it up himself on a Saturday morning while the kids were at breakfast. He stood back and looked at it for a moment. Emily appeared at his elbow. She looked at the sign. She read the name. "Who was Gerald Mercer?" she asked. "Someone who helped me," Jack said, "a long time ago." "Like how you helped us." He looked at the sign. "Like that?" "Yes." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Is he alive?" "No, he died in March." She stood beside him and looked at the sign in the way she looked at things she was thinking carefully about. "Does he know?" she said. "Does he know that you helped us?" Jack thought about that question. He thought about what it meant, the full weight of it, the chain of people who show up for other people, and then those people show up for other people, each link in the chain, not fully seeing the others, not knowing how far the thing extends. "I think so," he said. Emily considered this. Then she nodded the way she nodded when something made sense to her. She pulled out the small notebook she had started carrying in her cardigan pocket for garden notes and wrote something in it. Jack didn't ask what she wrote, but he saw over her shoulder that she had written the name carefully and exactly, Gerald Mercer, and beneath it in her 9-year-old handwriting, a single sentence. "He came for Jack. Jack came for us." By August, Caroline Gaines was visiting every Saturday. The supervised aspect of the visits had become by mutual agreement and with the caseworker's sign-off more of a formality than a reality. Caroline and Emily had developed a rhythm card games books. Caroline's stories about Emily's mother as a child, Emily's notes about the garden, Clara sitting on whatever surface was available and presiding over everything with the dignity appropriate to a doll with a trust fund named after her. The legal process of establishing Caroline as Emily's legal guardian was moving through its stages. Daniel had spoken honestly with both of them about the timeline, about what it meant, about the fact that Emily's stability at Hope Valley was not something to be disrupted carelessly. Caroline had not pushed, Emily had not been rushed, but something was building. Daniel could feel it the way you feel weather coming, not the exact shape of it yet, but the certainty that the air was changing. On a Saturday in August, Caroline arrived for her visit and asked to speak with Daniel first before seeing Emily. She sat in the chair across from his desk, Caroline's turn in the chair that Briggs had sat in, and Jack had sat in the chair that the people who mattered sat in when they had something important to say. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Okay. I've been looking at my situation. My house, my work, my everything. She paused. I have a 3-bedroom house 40 minutes from here. I work remotely. I have no significant obligations that would prevent me from... She stopped and started again. I want to bring Emily home. Not immediately, not without all the proper steps. But I want to be her guardian. I want to give her a home. Her voice was even and direct the way Emily's voice was even and direct. I know this is complicated. I know there are processes. I know you've been the person watching over her, and I'm not... She stopped again. I'm not trying to minimize what you've built here. She deserves a home. A specific home. With someone whose last name matches hers. Daniel looked at her. He thought about 11 years of running this place. He thought about what he had always believed in the deepest part of his understanding of this work, which was that a children's home was not an ending and was not supposed to be an ending. It was a place that held children until the right door opened, and then the right thing was to walk through that door. I thought about Emily Parker arriving in October with a canvas bag and a library book. He thought about Emily in February saying somebody always comes. He thought about Emily writing Gerald Mercer. He came for Jack. Jack came for us. He thought about a girl who was ready for a home, not because she was fragile, but because she was strong enough to walk through the door. Start the formal application, he said. I'll support it. Carolyn closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Thank you, she said. She'll make this easy, Daniel said. She always does. He told Emily that evening. He went to the library where she always was and sat down across from her and told her what Caroline had asked for and what he had answered. Emily listened all the way through. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. 40 minutes away, she said. Yes, that's not far. No, it's not. She looked at Clara. She looked at the rabbit. She looked at her notebook lying closed on the cushion beside her. Can I still come back, she said, not to live, but to visit, to check on the garden. Yes, Daniel said, always. She looked at him. You're not going to say anything about what I should do, she said. You're just going to tell me and let me decide. That's right. She looked at the window. She was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then she said, I think my mom would have wanted me to know her sister. She said it simply, directly, with the certainty of someone who has been turning a thing over for a long time and arrived at an answer that feels true. I think she would have wanted us to fix what she couldn't fix. I think that's what this is. Daniel looked at this 9-year-old girl and thought, in 30 years of living and 11 years of this work, I have never met anyone like her. I think so too, he said. Emily nodded once. She picked up her book. Okay, she said. The last Saturday in August, Jack came. He didn't announce it. He parked on River Road and came through the front door and found Daniel in the hallway and said, Where is everyone? Garden, Daniel said. He walked through the building and out the back door. The garden was full. All of the children were there in some capacity, some pulling weeds, some checking tomatoes. Marcus holding a zucchini of extraordinary size with the expression of a man who has caught a trophy fish. Karen was there. Tom was there. Calhoun was there because Calhoun had developed a habit of being in Silver Creek on Saturdays that no one questioned. Caroline was there, sitting on the bench with a book in her lap, not reading it, watching Emily move through the garden rows with her notebook. Jack stood at the back door and took it all in. Emily looked up from her notebook and saw him. She crossed the garden without hurrying and stopped in front of him. You said probably, she said. I did. You keep coming back. Apparently. She looked at him with those steady, careful eyes. Then she said, I'm going to go live with my aunt. I know, he said. Daniel told me. Are you going to come see me there when I'm not here anymore? He looked at her. He thought about Gerald Mercer writing letters to former residents, wanting to know they were all right. He thought about a chain of people who show up, each one because someone showed up for them, the chain extending in both directions, farther than any of them could see. Probably, he said. Emily Parker looked at him for a moment longer. Then she held out her hand. Jack Reynolds looked at the hand. He reached out and took it and shook it once, solemnly, the way you shake the hand of someone you respect. Good, Emily said, and went back to her garden. Jack stood at the door and watched her go. Watched her rejoin the rows of plants and open her notebook and say something to Marcus that made him look at the zucchini with new concern. Watched Carolyn look up from her unread book and smile at something Emily said. Watched Tom catch Jack's eye across the garden and nod once. He stood there for a long time. I thought about Christmas morning. He thought about Gerald Mercer turning on the lights in January. He thought about 41 motorcycles rolling through snow and a phone ringing at 6:47 and a man saying, "Give me the address." He thought about an anonymous email in a document that brought a powerful man to his knees and a trust fund named after a porcelain doll. I thought about what all of it added up to, what it meant when you laid all the pieces out and looked at what they had become. He thought, this is what happens when somebody comes. This garden, these children, this woman on a bench watching her niece take notes about beans. This building that is protected and funded and known and visible and standing. This girl who is going home. This is what happens. Daniel came to stand beside him. They watched the garden for a while without speaking. "She's going to be all right," Jack said. "Yes," Daniel said, "she is. The place is going to be all right too." "Yes." A silence, comfortable and full. "Gerald Mercer came for me," Jack said. "I came for you. Someday Emily's going to come for somebody. That's how it works." Daniel looked at the small green sign at the edge of the garden bed. Gerald Mercer Garden. He thought about what Emily had written in her notebook. He came for Jack. Jack came for us. "You really believe that?" Daniel said. Jack watched Emily kneel down to check something at the base of a tomato plant, watched her write something in her notebook with absolute concentration, watched her look up at Caroline and say something, and watched Caroline lean forward to hear it. "I know it," he said, and he was right. Because that is the truth about people who show up for the ones who need them. The truth that Gerald Mercer knew that Jack Reynolds learned and carried and acted on, that Daniel Whitmore had lived for 11 years inside these walls, that Emily Parker was already beginning to understand in the quiet, certain way she understood most things. The chain does not break, it extends. It reaches forward into time further than any of them can see, person to person, Christmas to Christmas, need to hand extended, and what looks like a single act of grace on a cold December morning is in fact the visible tip of something vast and old and indestructible. Hope Valley Children's Home stood in Silver Creek, protected and permanent and filled with the sounds of living. The garden grew, the chain held. And the children who had been left behind found one by one that somebody had always been coming for them. They just had to wait long enough to hear the sound